Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Protector of the Fairies in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Protector of the Fairies. He who gazes into the next moment. Glancing down as Baragan retreated back, Ichigo held his ground in the air for a few moments, simply setting to observe Baragan from above and wait for the Hollow's next move. The Hollow appeared to be rethinking his approach, cautious of him now that he had somehow bypassed the mist that surrounded the Hollow, but that was unlikely to last. Baragan would make a move shortly. With both eyes locked on his target, he saw the Hollow just waiting there for a moment, the mist still expanding slowly. And then, there was two of Baragan. He had to blink a few times at the sight, able to take this time only due to the fact that neither copy was moving towards him. Instead, one copy seemed satisfied to swim around in the mist, as if preparing for another assault. The other version acted not even a second after the first, performing very similar actions. He frowned. No, they weren't similar. Whatever the first did, the second did perfectly not long afterwards. From the way it moved through the mist to the path it took, none of it could be described as merely imitating itself. It was too perfect. He had seen this before too. When he had first held the weapon in his left hand currently, he had seen two of Aoesu for a brief moment, and the sensation had only vanished once he and Mavis had sealed the blade that had been made away. And then there had been that first moment just now against Baragan. He had reacted purely on instinct, and his strike had been intended to do more than chip away at Baragan's skull. He had hit, but he could hardly call it a successful hit. What was this dagger's ability anyway? Mavis had said something about stasis, and he had taken the risk to strike just now because it was a prime opportunity. And it had ended up cutting through the mist like it wasn't even there, doing more than he could have without a hell of a lot of wind pressure. Stasis. Time. Baragan's mist was essentially an accelerator. It aged whatever it touched, until nothing was left. All things would eventually crumple given enough time. Had the dagger halted that? Had it frozen the time acceleration in that moment? He glanced at the dagger for an instant before returning his gaze onto Baragan. He still needed more answers, but he had plenty of time to get them right now. Baragan had yet to make a move though, so he might as well take the initiative himself. Or at least force Baragan to make a move. What he did was the peak of foolishness, he knew that. But even so, he took the large form of Tensou Zanjutsu before throwing it straight down towards the ground, letting it slam down into the earth below and embed itself in the crater it made. Even if Baragan's senses were gone here, he knew the Hollow would not have missed what he just did. So much magic flowed through his blade that it would have easily been picked up after it left his hand. In other words, he had just announced to Baragan that he had thrown away his Bankai's blade. He knew what such an action would sound like to the Hollow. "I don't need that blade to kill you," he muttered. "Is that what you think I'm saying right now?" He could see fury morph onto one of the two copies of Baragan, appearing on the second quickly after. Baragan hated him, and his action just now would scream that he was being looked down upon. That he was so weak that he didn't even need to be fought seriously. And as he wanted, Baragan began to rush up at him, pushing a lot more magic into his mist and forcing it to spread out at an alarming rate. He knew what Baragan was likely after. He wanted to trap him again, only this time in a way that ensured he couldn't escape as easily as last time. Was that how the Hollow wanted to play this? Unfortunately, he wasn't willing to be as accommodating as last time here. He wanted to test the limits of this power he and Mavis had forged, and he had no intention to allow Baragan to leave here alive, no matter what. Charging forward to meet Baragan head-on, he noticed how the form of the two seemed to blend into one at his angle. All he could see was the first in his line of sight, the mist protecting Baragan within a thin layer as it tried to keep up with the Hollow's actions. It was a perfect target to test the knife on. He struck out at the last second, knowing there was far more than enough time to hit Baragan with his speed. His arm shot out further than he wanted, but his swing completed its intended arc, slicing through the mist before him and through Baragan's head. At least it was meant to. He realized immediately something was wrong when he didn't even feel any resistance at all from his strike. It was then that the sight before him changed. Baragan was further back, almost as if he had stopped briefly, but there was another version before him, one that appeared to be trying to go above him, the Hollow's skull already above his own. How? He had struck at the right time, and he had taken into account the dagger's length. So how had he missed? How hadn't he hit? Mist was spreading down at him from above, but he didn't want to miss the chance to hit Baragan here. As he began to move his arm to swing up at the mist, preparing to first rid himself of the current danger and then try and get another chance at attacking Baragan, the sight before him changed once again. Was that his arm? It was. It even held the same blade he was holding right now. But that was impossible. He could still feel it in his left hand, and he knew he hadn't struck yet. So how was it there too? He couldn't waste any time thinking like this. He let himself lash out, slicing through the mist only for his sight to shift once again. This time he didn't even dare hang around near Baragan, kicking off the air and rushing down towards the ground. Baragan gave chase, but he knew full well that he could outrun the hollow. And until he allowed Baragan to catch up, he could think what he was seeing. He glanced back at Baragan in the distance, noticing how it was hard to see the other copy of Baragan at this distance. And then, he brought up his right hand and covered where his right eye had been. Baragan was further away now, if only just. Bringing his hand back down, Baragan was suddenly further forward. Could it be? He had to check. Darting across to one side, allow himself a clear view of both versions of Baragan, he covered the space where his right eye had been once again only to see one of the two copies of Baragan vanish. Taking the hand away once again, he hesitated for a brief moment before doing the same with his left eye. He had expected to be greeted with pure darkness, aware that he could only see out of one eye now. But what greeted him was still light. One of the versions of Baragan vanished, but this time it wasn't the same. The one that remained was the one the other had been copying, and when he took his hand back down he could see both once again. He understood now. He knew what he was seeing. Maybe it was a result of holding the knife, or maybe it was because a more permanent connection had been forged between him and Mavis, or more specifically her magic itself. Whatever the case, he knew the result. What he was seeing in his left eye was the present. And what was visible where his right should be was the future. It explained his confusion at what he was seeing. The double vision was being caused by the two conflicting images being shown and processed by his mind at once. Since he was receiving the information at the same time, his mind was naturally thinking that the two events were happening at once rather than one occurring after the other. It explained why he had missed too. He had aimed for a Baragan that technically did not exist yet. What bothered him though was when the vision had changed. When he had struck, the Baragan he had been aiming for, the future version of Baragan, had vanished, and a new one had appeared elsewhere. Baragan had been intending to charge at him, but what in the hollow's eyes was a random swing likely confused it and made it hesitate. And so Baragan had altered his approach at the last moment and changed his plans so that he would attempt to strike from above instead. And when he had intended to strike out at that version of Baragan, he had seen his arm appear in that future. It could only be a result of the changes he himself was causing. Based on the explanations Mavis had told him in the past, time typically could not be changed. It followed a strict route, where everything could be said to be predetermined. The choices people would make were already recorded, and from an observer's standpoint it might as well all be history if looked at. But from previous encounters, both ones he experienced and ones experienced by others, he knew time could be changed. The greatest example of that was what the future versions of his friends had done, utilizing the Eclipse Gate to change the future. It might not always be for the better, but it was undeniable that the very action of that event had altered what should have been predetermined. In the end, it all came down to one magic that could alter what should be predetermined. Time magic. No matter what time it was, no matter what its purpose was, any and all forms of time magic were capable of altering the natural order of time. Aging a plant into a great tree, for example, was aging it more than it should be, and would result in changes even if they could be extremely small at a glance. Traveling back in time, armed with the knowledge of events to come, meanwhile could alter so much, and it did. The dragon invasion from the past was halted, and the war that took place was not following the same path as it did in the future Mest had come from. What he was doing right now with this magic likely fell somewhere in the middle ground of those two extremes. He was merely seeing the future, the current absolute future, and right now it only seemed to be a second at most ahead of real time. But seeing the future meant knowing it. Just possessing that knowledge guaranteed a change. But it was so minor at first that he couldn't see it. But when he actively acted to change the future, what he saw also vanished. By striking out at Baragan when he did, he had changed the future from Baragan continuing his charge at him to Baragan dodging above him and attacking from there. When he had seen the mist, he had prepared to strike out, and no sooner had he prepared to do so had he seen his arm within the future, signifying the result of that action. It was an interesting power. He had sacrificed his right eye, and in exchange gained a new one it seemed. An eye of time, witnessing events that were yet to unfold. This kind of power, it was certainly one he could use here in his plans. He kept an eye on Baragan as he came to another stop, seeing the hollow still rushing after him. He let his focus snap onto both copies of Baragan before he prepared himself to move, being patient enough to wait. And then, he prepared to leap forward with his full strength. He had to stop himself right before he could, blinking a few times as he tried to refocus on what was in front of him. He had missed one important fact it seemed. He had missed it initially, moving normally, and not spending as much time considering his actions, but now that he was actively aware of what the sight from where his right eye was doing it was harder to ignore. And so when he had prepared to charge forward, he had noticed how his vision had blurred from the two eyes. He should have realized it quicker. The only reason his vision could still be so in sync that he could see double was if they were seeing things from the same distance. So when he had prepared to charge forward at full speed, he had suddenly gotten a completely different sight coming into his new right eye that wasn't sharing details with his left. It was like he was looking from two different places at once. His mind hadn't been able to cope properly. It couldn't combine the two images without distorting what he was seeing too much. With time he was sure he could get used to it, but it still hurt his head now trying to analyze what he was seeing when he did that. However, if he could just bear through the pain or find a way around it for the time being. An idea was forming, but he wasn't sure it would work as perfectly as he hoped it would. Still, it was worth a try. And he still needed to get a proper look at how the knife he held worked. Baragan was closer this time, so he wouldn't have to charge as far. He didn't need as much strength to push off from the air, and so he adjusted how much he would need and closed his left eye for an instant. He couldn't waste time here. Even moment was precious, and as fast as he could he began adjusting the amount of strength he was preparing to use. His vision changed rapidly, distances shrinking and growing before his eyes. And then finally, when he was happy with the future he saw, he opened his left eye and kicked off from the air. Baragan sensed him arrive before him like always and looked to be preparing to move, but he could already see where Baragan was moving to. What was more, he could tell that his plan had worked quite well. Normally when he tried to move such large distances, he missed his intended target. He never meant to, but he moved too fast for even his mind to keep up with at times. Even short distances were hard, but it was when he had to cover a greater space that he ended up over or undershooting. He just wasn't used to his Bankai yet, having little chance to ever use it in battle or training due to its power, and so he couldn't regulate the force he used properly. This time he hadn't overshot. He had landed exactly where he had wanted to go. Rather than overshooting, he had merely adjusted the strength he was about to use and allowed the future he saw in his right eye to show him the result. But he knew he could do better. He had lost some speed doing it this way. What he would really need was a way to halt himself at the right time when moving at full speed. Perhaps if, after moving, he did the same process and found the best time to apply enough to force to bring him to a complete stop. It might damage his body a bit, but at this point what was a bit more damage for his regeneration to deal with. Having proper control over his speed would be more than worth it. There would be time for testing later though. He was closer to Baragan now. He wasn't going to have the problem with his vision becoming too distorted at such a short range. Now he only had to strike. Swinging up, he aimed for an arm this time. It would give him a larger target, and the large amount of mist that surrounded Baragan was a decent test for the blade itself. This time he made sure to not aim for the future version, instead focusing on the present version of Baragan and allow himself to see the future unfold. He was going to hit, he could see that as the future updated. But there was another problem. In the corner of his vision he could see mist encroaching in. A surprise attack? Or just Baragan accelerating the mist creation process? It had been going faster than before, so this could be a ploy to catch him off guard. And he already knew that Baragan wasn't opposed to taking losses to achieve success. What would an arm be if he could inflict an equally serious wound on his enemy? He could avoid it. There was still time. But doing so would mean pulling back mid-swing and throwing away this chance. He didn't want that. Baragan was only going to keep pulling tricks like this, and he couldn't afford to waste too much time in trying to test out this weapon. Couldn't he do both here though? He already knew the limits of his speed. He was fast. Fast enough that if he moved his body with the blade and swung back, he should be able to reach the mist in time and have the blade cut into it. It was risky, as he still hadn't confirmed its power yet. But he was confident enough to trust in what he had seen so far. The blade wasn't going to reach though. The future was already updating to his thoughts, the knowledge that he was going to perform those actions forcing a chance. But it still wasn't going to be enough. He had overextended. It would take too long to swing back. With the dagger about to cut into Baragan's arm, he felt the blade made contact and begin go tear through. It was then that he made his move. He had to be faster than ever here. Not on his speed, but at the time it would take to adjust the future. He didn't have time to let the blade come to a stop in its arc, so he had to instead pull back with enough force to bring it to a stop and then back along the arc he needed it to go. He was running out of time. The mist was almost on him in that future and the knife wasn't there yet. Each moment had the knife traveling further into Baragan's arm and requiring more force to bring it back. It made it harder and harder to try and adjust for it, but he also had it. Just a bit more and he had it. As the knife cut through the last of Baragan's arm, he threw all the force he needed into his arm and forced its momentum to first halt the blade and then pull it back down, spinning his body as he swung. He knew instantly he hadn't gotten it exactly right. He hadn't full accounted for the forces from his sudden push off the air to cause him to spin, the small act setting him off target slightly. His knife was going to hit late. As a tiny part of the mist brushed against the skin of his arm, he felt what he could only assume was the same pain Shinji had felt throughout his body when he had been torn apart through time. The pain didn't last though, not when the dagger sliced straight into the mist in the next instance and released what he could only describe as blinding light. With hardly any time to think, he darted away from Baragan and brought the blade up to his arm, ready to sever any pieces of him aging. Only to find none were. Bits of the purple mist were lingering on his arm, trying to spread, but they were being burnt away by that same golden light that the dagger radiating. Correction, they weren't being burnt away, he realized. Rather, they were simply fading as the golden light touched them, giving them the appearance of being burnt away. He knew it for certain now. While he still had some uncertainty on the dagger's true nature, it was definitely halting the mist. It was the only explanation to why it was fading away from his body like this. The mist had been working, but the moment it came into contact with the dagger and the light it had released, it simply came to a stop. Whether the dagger's power was truly simple stasis or something else, it no longer mattered to him. What mattered was that he understood for certain now that this was a weapon capable of breaking through Baragan's mist. Turning towards Baragan, he noticed how the hollow had shot down towards the ground. Was he retrieving his arm? He frowned, following the hollow's flight pattern for as long as he could before the hollow fully vanished into the mist. What was Baragan planning? He didn't have any instant regeneration, but it didn't mean he didn't have ways to heal himself. A limb could always be reattached if the one doing the work had enough skill. Was this the reason? Was Baragan buying time? His eyes widened as movement became visible to his right eye. The mist was expanding, and he had merely moments to process the information he saw from the future before it became reality. He knew where Baragan was going. The hollow was going for Tensou Zanjutsu. He knew immediately that the blade would not work for Baragan. No Shinigami's Zanpakuto would work willingly for another. They made the job as hard as possible. The Quincy had barely managed to make a device capable of stealing Bankai's, and that device resulting in sealing their own power in order to control the stolen energy. However, Baragan didn't need to use his blade to reach it. The hollow knew now that the dagger could cut through his mist. There was no way he didn't know, but in the end that weapon was still only a dagger. It would be hard to get the blows he wanted unless he got extremely close, and even if he was fast there were limits if an attack came from too many directions. The dagger's range would limit his reach too much, and it didn't have nearly the impact that Tensou Zanjutsu's size did. Baragan meant to ensure he couldn't reclaim that blade. Did Baragan think that the ability was shared in both blades? He knew Baragan couldn't see right now, so it was possible that he believed that it was still an ability from Tensou Zanjutsu and not Lumen Histo Ire. Well, Baragan wasn't technically wrong. Aoyasu had mentioned that he should be able to pour the power into the larger blade if he made the two blades one. Without truly realizing it, Baragan had stumbled upon an actual truth here. He couldn't let him reach his sword. As close as Baragan was, as far as he needed to travel to catch up, it still didn't matter in the end. He was far faster, and this time he didn't spare any time to look into the future. He just kicked off, accepting the blurred vision for a second before he slammed straight into the crater where his sword rested. Baragan was still closing in. He could see the hollow's objective here. The mist had been gathered well. Baragan was going to submerge this entire area in mist, and he could tell it was too late to escape if he moved to grab his blade. The time it would take would be too long. Still, he did it anyway. If he didn't take his blade now, Baragan would ensure it would become unreachable. He had yet to ever try remaking his Bankai's blade, and he didn't want to test that ability now if he could help it. No matter how strong his blade was, it would eventually crumble under that much mist. With the sword now resting in his right hand once again, he glanced round quickly at the closing barrier. No way out now, and the level of mist around him at a glance seemed denser than before. There would be no easy way out this time. But he might not need one. Looking at both blades, he ran through the possible options in his head. How would he fuse them? Would it be the same as with his Bankai? Or did he just have to trust his gut? He fell on the latter, allowing his instincts to guide his actions. The blades needed to become one, so he allowed his instinct to take over and follow the knowledge that could only be discovered through recognizing one's self. This blade was connected to his Bankai, so like how he knew how to release his Bankai, he should also know how to connect to the two. Raising the dagger, he rested it against the middle of the blade, just above the hilt. The action felt familiar as he performed it, his mind slowly understanding that this was what was needed, and before he knew it the weight in his left hand vanished as the blade sunk into the blade. The chain of Tensou Zanjutsu shattered. And then it was reforged. And then it shattered again. The process seemed never-ending to his eyes, with the image visible in one eye constantly being seen in the other a second later. He chuckled as he began to understand what it represented. It was the constant breaking of the expected future and bringing of a new one. As the knife finished merging, the inner part of the blade began to glow, releasing the same golden light as the dagger before the same strange markings began to appear across it too. He could feel the energy of the knife growing stronger. Was his Bankai's blade amplifying it? He smiled at the thought, glancing up towards the mist and preparing his next move. He could cut his way through fast enough, but he doubted it would be that easy. Would the energy from the blade be capable of influencing an energy-based attack like a Getchuga Tenshou? It was possible, but he should probably test it before he used all the limited energy he could draw upon for one. Getchuga Tenshou. With a quick swing he slashed upwards. What he had expected was a small blast to emerge, not the large one that met his gaze as it shot upwards. He saw movement above as Baragan shot out of the way, the attack slamming straight into the mist and detonating in a large blast of golden light. As it began to fade, it was then he noticed the sizable chunk taken out of the mist above them. That had not been his intention. He had expected the attack to be smaller. He had only drawn on a little bit of power. Where had all the extra? Mavis. Of course. They had noticed in Aoyasu's presence how he had been drawing some of her magical power unconsciously when he was holding the knife. He must have tapped into it subconsciously when he made to swing, acting as if he was releasing a normal blast rather than a test one. He frowned again though at the mere thought of it. If this was a result of his subconscious drawing power, could he actively draw on more? The biggest weakness of his Bankai was that it suppressed all the magical power in his body, without exception. Anything he drew in was used immediately for regenerative purposes, resulting in very little that he could use for energy-based attacks that would generally need to be gathered and held externally when he wanted to use them. But Mavis wasn't him. She wasn't under the same rules here, and she had so much magical power to spare that she had no problem with the fact he would be able to draw some from her when he needed it. It was a different source for the energy to be drawn from, only without causing any problems for his regeneration. "Sorry to do this without asking Mavis," he muttered. She'd been so quietly lately in this fight, even though he was sure she still should have been able to reach him through his mind. Perhaps he should check later. He hoped she could hear this. Right now he would need a lot of energy very quickly for this. Raising his blade up, he let it spin so that he was holding it with a reverse grip. Then he poured the energy into the blade. Like he always did with the Getchuga Tenshou, he fed his blade energy until it was leaking from the blade itself, giving the edge a golden aura that began to glow brighter and brighter with each passing second. He didn't have long. The mist was closing in. But with the energy being brought in directly from Mavis rather than from around him, he had nothing to fear. He already had enough for the purpose of this. At this point he was borrowing more for one simple purpose. "You can't hear this, Baragan," Ichigo muttered, feeling the limit of the energy he could keep tied to the blade being reached, "but I'll say this anyway. I want you to watch. Watch as your greatest weapon is stripped away in an instant, leaving you with nothing. I'll make you feel as powerless as I felt when Shinji died in my arms. And then I'll kill you." With the last of the energy gathered, Ichigo slammed the blade straight into the ground, releasing the largest Getchuga Tenshou he could all around him. His vision vanished for a few moments, completely blinded by the light as it spread out in all directions and smashed into the mist, threatening to swallow him whole. And then it continued, further and further as it expanded outwards. When the mist finally cleared, Ichigo merely looked up at where Baragan had been, watching as the hollow slammed into the ground nearby. With a smile he didn't remember making, and one that he knew would have been worrying if he had seen it on anyone else's face, he pulled his sword out of the ground and began to walk towards the hollow. He didn't have much to fear at this moment. After all, there was not a trace of the mist left. Coming to a stop right before Baragan, he stared at the hollow before noticing it had a new arm, one that looked different from the one he had severed. "So you can heal somewhat. That's good." Without another word he swung his blade down, severing the hollow's arm again before stepping back. "Go ahead. Build up your power once more. Repair yourself as many times as you like. I'm not going to let this end yet. You don't get to escape that easily. Protector of the Fairies. My fellow apostles, our time is nearly at hand. I ask you once again to offer your prayers to our Lord so that he may soon rise again. All of our work is for his sake." "Another of these ceremonies?" Levi asked, looking towards Laxus in disgust. "Do they never get tired of them?" "They're doing this daily, so I doubt that," muttered Laxus, growling at the nearest fanatic as he dared to approach them. "You got any idea what the priest is planning?" "My patience is growing thin." Levi shrugged. "I thought he was being cryptic. But he's not, which is even more annoying honestly. He keeps talking about stuff like how the moment is approaching and how the chosen is almost ready. Though I have noticed how few people there are running around recently." "You noticed that too, huh?" Laxus frowned, scratching his chin in thought. "Most of the senior leadership were sent somewhere recently. No idea where beyond mentioning of a need to prepare a site. I think one mentioned something about Alvarez, but I can't be sure." "Alvarez?" Levi scowled at the name, letting her disgust be clear to any around her. "They better not be involving us with that matter. That takes us too far away from the front lines. I'm fine with causing trouble around some of the countries of Ishgar, even if I'd rather be in Fiori, but I don't plan to go any further away." "I'm of the same mind," Laxus stated, getting to his feet and gesturing for her to follow. She took only a moment to grab her staff and was following after him quickly afterwards. "What do you say about getting out of here? We hung around long enough, and I think we've more than paid our debts. And thanks to their lessons on how to use this energy, I feel like we will just need a few more practice sessions before we go after Ichigo again." "I do like that sound of that," muttered Levi, tilting her head in thought. "You don't think Arlok will send people after us?" "He certainly will, but he should already know what we care about. This stupid religion of theirs doesn't matter in the slightest to us, no matter how much they claim we are blessed or gifted by their so-called God. Let Avatar run around like this, chasing after straws, while we actual do what we've been waiting on. If that's the case, stated Levy, then I know just the place to start. Though just to check, the Eclipse Gate should still be handling the paradoxes, right? Even if it's destroyed. We got away with minor stuff, but I'd like to be sure. If it isn't, then that means we were lied to. But nothing has gone wrong so far. What plan is this anyway that has you so worried? Oh, just a good place for us to practice, Levy muttered, letting a sadistic smile appear across her face. We need to test our magic on good mages after all. But why stop at merely good? No, we want excellent. And there just so happens to be a perfect guild out there for us to get some practice from. It'll draw Ichigo out quite well too, Laxus muttered, a smirk matching Levy's appearing across his face. I heard there's a familiar face as their guild master too. Should make for an interesting experience. So we're in agreement. Laxus nodded. Of course. It's such a shame that there's no Fantasia parade. I would have been fitting for the second battle of Fairy Tale. Protector of the Fairies. Your report. We have had little luck, Your Majesty, Askin said as he bowed before Waiwak. I've explored the locations you instructed me to but have had little luck at discovering anything of interest. All I could find was the lingering remains of what was a particularly foul kind of poison. Magical barrier particles, I assume, Waiwak muttered. Your ability has proven well at resisting their effects. And Pernida? Has he had any success? He is afraid to say he hasn't, but he does has hope. He reported to me that he has a possible lead and is working on tracing the source down. Should I tell him to fall back and wait for instructions? Waiwak shook his head. Time is short. Allow him to follow this lead and go to back him up. We cannot afford to lose Pernida. He is too important. Very well, sir. I shall make haste to inform him immediately. Waiwak watched as one of the last of his most loyal soldiers left him through his sole remaining eye, allowing the doors to shut before he let himself think in silence. He was running out of time. The future where everything turned dark to his eyes was drawing closer, and yet he hadn't the slightest idea of what would cause that future to occur. He knew it wasn't because he died. All futures went dark, and he was alive in all of them right before it happened. He had checked his body for any kind of disease or poison and found nothing. He had since then been carefully checking any food he took, not even trusting his most loyal soldier to know if it was safe or not to eat. And not once did he dare let his senses drop unless there was someone to watch over him and protect him while he slept, on the off chance that they could get past the array of barriers first in their path. And yet still nothing changed. With the lengths he was going to be sure he couldn't die from some unseen means, set up prior to this moment in the future. He could only assume something terrible happened at that moment his vision ended it. And yet the world certainly remained, else he would have seen signs of the destruction. To block his sight, it meant either time itself had come to an end, an unlikely option currently, or that something was blocking it. And only one thing would have the capability to blind him like this. Magical barrier particles. The only question was how. Not a single future was visible. At the same moment in every future, his sight went dark. Why was that? What was the cause of it? So long as there was magic, he should be able to perceive the future. For him to not be able to. It was a worrying thought. One he had to take actions to prevent. Though he couldn't stop the doubts that sprung up in his mind, ones that refused to leave no matter how much he tried. Ones that asked him what chance he had when he had yet to discover a future in which he had stopped it from occurring. Protector of the Fairies. Arlok, sir. Let me guess, Arlok said, not even looking back from the relic he was praying before. The two are gone, correct? Yes, sir, the follower behind him replied, Arlok dismissing him with a wave of his hand. Do not worry about such matters. It is the will of Mimi Heiji that they go now. Just continue your duty. Waiting until the man left, Arlok made to stand before turning towards the other occupant of the room. It seems they left quicker than I thought they would, marry. I told you they would, the girl stated with a smile. Are you sure we shouldn't chase after them? Aren't they important for the plan? Arlok nodded. They are, but their purpose lies elsewhere. They believe themselves to be acting freely, when in reality they are merely another cog in the desires we of Avatar wish to unleash. They will certainly cause chaos out there, and that is what we need. From this point onwards, we can no longer hide in the shadows. Avatar must become known, and once we will have every Ukin in the world after our heads. Those fools will try to stop us, and we must hope the chaos those two bring about will be enough to buy us time. Can they do it on their own though? Asked Mary curiously. They seem strong, but there's only two of them. There is the possibility of that. Which is why I have already asked BG9 to follow them if they were to leave. He should keep the ignorant masses off their backs long enough for them to cause the chaos they desire. We may lose him in the process of course, but his sacrifice will not be in vain if that comes to pass. It sounds so fun, Mary muttered wishfully. Can't I go watch them at least? You will be needed shortly, Arlok stated. If you wish though, I will have Keys inform you of the details later on. He has orders to not interfere in their affairs except in the worst case scenario. You could say it is my thanks to them for being so helpful for us. Mary nodded in understanding. Still, it's such a shame they're going to miss it. Have you already gone to talk to the Chosen? I shall be leaving now to pick him up. Mimi Heiji revealed to be the moment where everything will become open to us, and I shall not hesitate to take advantage of that moment. Soon, Arlok added, smiling under his mask as he turned back towards the relic he had been praying to. Soon we shall have the one prophesied to bring about Mimi Hagi's will. All we have to do is wait for the moment. And then one of magic's precious Ukin shall join us of their own free will. Protector of the fairies. A protector that could never save anyone. 743, Ichigo stated, walking back away from the once again fallen form of Baragan. That's the 83rd time I've taken off your right arm now. Still not suffering any side effects yet. He only had to spare a glance back to get his answer. Suppose you are going by your diminished state. It had become something of an amusement. No, that wasn't right. Amusement wasn't what he was feeling right now. Not for a lack of trying, admittedly. He wanted to be laughing at this situation. To be taking pleasure in it. But he just seemed to get angrier when he realized he wasn't experiencing any of that. In what he was sure must have felt like he was distracted in Baragan's mind, he swiftly stepped off the ground and shot forward, far out of the reach of the mist that had threatened to swallow him whole. He spared a glance at the sheer quantity summoned so quickly for a moment, feeling slightly impressed that Baragan could still summon up so much at such short notice. Had the hollow been hiding it within its body somehow? Still, such feelings quickly died as quickly as the mist did. He merely had to step back in and slice out with his blade, releasing a small wave of energy and destroying any trace of threat before him. He could see it in his right eye as he took another step, correcting his strength so that he landed perfectly in front of Baragan. It was getting easier, he noticed. It appeared like all this time wasn't being wasted, as with each use he needed less time to adjust his strength, on a few rare occasions even getting it right from the start. The only aspect still difficult was adjusting to the sudden disorientation that would come from when he moved too far while both eyes were open. As he arrived before Baragan, he raised his sword and began to swing. He could already see the result. Nothing that would happen now would save Baragan. The hollow before him was completely helpless and was falling at his feet. So he stopped. His blade came to a complete stop right before it would have impacted with Baragan's skull. The next moment his leg came up and slammed straight into what remained currently of Baragan's ribs, sending the hollow skidding across the ground. He knew it would have done a lot of damage with the force he put into it, but he hadn't seen Baragan dying from that. So long as the hollow was still alive, it could recover. 744, Ichigo muttered as he began the process of walking towards the hollow. It would still take a bit of time for Baragan to get back into fighting state. He could take his time getting there. He was in no rush just yet. 744 times. That was how many times he had been able to kill Baragan, and each and every time he had stopped the moment he was sure he had won completely. He knew what the others would have said about his actions. That they were foolish. That he was being stupid, allowing even a chance for Baragan to fight back. But he didn't care. Not one bit. Killing Baragan right now didn't interest him. Baragan would die, but not until he was done. until he was sure he had got what he was after. Would Baragan actually survive up to that point, however? Running would do the hollow no good. If he even sensed like the hollow was going to run, then he would simply cut it off before it could try, and neither would fighting. He saw Baragan's moves before they even occurred or reacted faster than Baragan could plan for, and so any surprise attacks failed no matter how Baragan tried to use them. At this point all the hollow could do was try and endure the punishment being thrown at it. It was taking a toll on Baragan. After seeing the hollow's method of recovery enough times, he had come to a single conclusion. It had limited uses. The hollow's entire body was made of bones, and by utilizing a small amount from another area it could be reshaped and aged through time into whatever Baragan desired. Taking only a few major wounds was unlikely to do much, but he had not been kind in their clashes. He might not have killed Baragan yet, but that didn't mean he wasn't ensuring the hollow suffered after each clash. As a result, the hollow had been forced to repair itself countless times. What had been a giant form initially, towering over him, was now smaller than him, with few ribs present and far smaller arms. Even the hollow's skull had been forced to shrink, though not by much. He doubted Baragan had wanted to risk utilizing bone from such an important part of himself unless he had little choice. In the hollow's current state, he didn't know how many more times it could fix itself back up. Could it manage it only once more? Twice? Or could it go on for much longer, until it becomes as small as an infant? At what point would Baragan's size become too small for him to function at? Did Baragan even know? He doubted Baragan did. That would have required being brought to the brink of death countless times to even reach this point. And it would have meant risking death itself, even if just testing his limitations. He and Baragan were both in the dark on this, he reckoned, not that Baragan would ever admit it. The hollow spoke very little, knowing perfectly well that no response would be able to be heard. A quick glance into the distance made him pause, frowning at the sight briefly as he realized something was off with what he was seeing. Didn't Baragan look taller than before? And slightly different? Was it another form? Had Baragan prepared a final trump card beyond his second form? He threw the thoughts out a moment later as he shook his head, recognized the sight before him. Baragan had changed forms, but it wasn't an upgrade. Rather, it was a downgrade. Baragan was back in his initial resurrection now, struggling up to his feet and falling back down. Appearing closer to Baragan with a single step forward, he eyed the hollow curiously, as if looking for any signs of deception. But for the life of him, he didn't see anything. Not presently and not near in the future. Just looking at Baragan's body started to give him an idea though of what the problem was. The hollow's limbs looked much thinner. Thinking about it, he hadn't had many chances to see or hear what happened when a hollow changed out of its resurrection. Taking the form had the ability to heal all wounds previously suffered, but changing back didn't seem to have the same luxury. Baragan's larger form had been restored, but his limbs in turn had weakened tremendously from the look of it. Could Baragan even still swing his axe like this? A brief bit of movement caught his right eye's attention, and by the time Baragan started to move in his left eye he had already seen what the hollow meant to do. The axe he hadn't been sure was usable was extending out from Baragan's right arm as he swung, the momentum of the swing doing most of the work. It might have worked on someone else, but for him it was just too pathetic to watch. Baragan was too slow like this. Before the blade could reach him, his own swung up far faster and shattered the axe into pieces. It would have never been so easy before. But when Baragan couldn't even put any weight behind it and was already this weak, it made it easy to throw his full force into the strike and leave Baragan defenseless. The hollow wasn't done for yet though. Mist sprung up, as if Baragan hoped it would be enough to win. It wasn't. The amount Baragan could summon now was pitiful compared to what his second resurrection was capable of. He could easily bring his sword back down and slice through it, but it was even easier to simply pour a small amount of magic into the blade and release it, the energy from Mavis detonating around them and destroying any trace of the magic threatening to harm him. It was only then he brought his sword down, stopping it right before Baragan's shoulder. If he had continued, he would have sliced the hollow in half from his shoulder to his hip. 745. Oh. I wondered what you were doing, Baragan stated. He had expected the hollow to sound angry at him or to look confused at why he was still alive. but all he got was amusement instead, as if none of this truly bothered Baragan. I haven't been keeping proper track, but am I right in assuming that is the number of times you could have killed me? You seem pretty calm despite that. I'm starting to wonder if you really do have something still up your sleeve. He only heard laughter in return, causing him to scowl until he forced Baragan to stop laughing by slamming his fist into the hollow's chest. He felt it cave in beneath his punch, Baragan's body beginning to fly back, but before it could get far he passed it and caught it by Baragan's right arm, using it to slam Baragan back down against the ground. He had hoped to feel even a bit of satisfaction when the arm came off by accident when Baragan hit the ground, but he just felt angrier if anything. Is that another count? His sword was hovering over Baragan's skull before he could finish. Ichigo's gaze locked on the hollow. As much as he despised saying it, he gave the hollow his answer. 746. Without another word he quickly backed away, leaving the arm he had ripped from Baragan behind. However, the hollow made no move to pick it back up. Instead, Baragan merely focused on getting to his feet, the remains of his axe being summoned and used as a makeshift crutch. He waited a bit longer. And yet all that met him was a stare. Still standing there, Baragan just looked at him. No attempts were being made to heal, nor were they being made to try and fight back. If he had to say anything, it looked like Baragan had given up. What are you doing? He only just realized he had taken a few steps forward in anger, his grip on his sword tightening as his fury grew. Hurry up and heal. No. I'm sorry. What did you say? I said no, Baragan repeated. I have no need to fight any longer. Prolonging this is foolish for me. What the hell are you saying? Was he shouting? It sounded like he was. Before Baragan could blink, he had closed the distance between the two, gripping the hollow by its cloak and pulling Baragan up into the air. Careful. I might pull some last-ditch effort. Mist shot out from Baragan's cloak, brushing alone his left hand. At least it did in his right eye. A burst of light shot out from his sword all around them as he released another weak Getchuga Tenshou, the energy enough to disable Baragan's own weakened energy. You were saying. Fascinating. Those words weren't directed at him, it seemed. He doubted Baragan could even pretend to think such thoughts about him, even in the privacy of his own mind. Instead, the hollow's gaze was on where his right eye should have been. I hadn't truly noticed this before, but now that I can see again I realized what you were doing. That golden light where your right eye should be. I knew I was right. Is this Lumen Histoire's work? This is Mavis's work, Ichigo growled out. It doesn't matter what you do. You can't stop me. I know that, Baragan replied calmly. This explains why you were always able to react to me so quickly. I first thought it was speed, but you actually see me performing the actions, don't you? I launched a surprise attack you and yet you didn't even bat an eye at it. You already knew what I was planning and countered it. If this is even a fraction of what Lumen Histoire can do for its wielder, I can see why Wywak and Zeref seek it so badly. A shame it ended up in your hands, Baragan stated as he finally tore his gaze away. But there was a silver lining. Go on. Kill me. Begging now. Begging. Baragan scoffed. Not to you. Never to you. No, I'm just making suggestions. Adding taunts too, I suppose. So go on. Kill me. Or does another have to die first? Ichigo snarled before he threw Baragan straight back against the ground, bringing his sword down and slicing off Baragan's other arm. And yet he didn't even get a response back, Baragan gritting his teeth to silence himself. Go on. Kill me. Giving up? After everything you said? After everything you did? After Shinji died? You brought about that fate yourself, Baragan stated, a sword immediately slamming into his chest and breaking more of his bones in the process. Is that 747 now? He asked through gritted teeth, trying not to show any signs of discomfort. When will you deal the final blow? Get up. No. I have no reason to fight you any longer. You are the winner of this battle. So go ahead. Kill me. You think that's it? Ichigo shouted. You can just let this end here? After what you've done? No, I'm not done with you yet. Without a second thought he threw back his sword, crouching down beside Baragan's body before he stabbed his hand through the cloak and ripped out a rib. Not yet. If you can't heal anymore, I'll just take my time. I won't let you die peacefully. You don't deserve that. Go ahead then. Take a bit longer if you wish. As another rib was torn out, Baragan refused to utter even a single grunt of pain. It was only after the fourth did he finally slip up, and yet the smirk that followed didn't die even when another was first broken and then pulled out piece by piece. It only grew further as Ichigo made to stand once again, turning his back to reach for his sword. This is my victory. He roared in amusement, mist expanding out beneath his feet and letting them fall first while the rest of the ground aged. It was the quickest way for him to get to his feet without his arms now, and as Ichigo turned he was already leaping at him, mist expanding out in all directions. All of it vanished a moment later as golden light enveloped his vision, and then a sword was stopped right in front of his face. What was that you said about victory? I said it's my victory, Baragan stated, unable to hold back the satisfaction he felt at the sight before him. Go on. Kill me. It matters little anymore. Because I win. Really? Because it doesn't look like that from here. But I have, Baragan replied confidently. Whether you fall by my hands or another, I could have seen that as a victory. Your physical form would have been destroyed forever. But this? This is far more satisfying. This is what I desired the most. So strike me down. No matter what happens here today, Ichigo Kurosaki is dead. Ichigo's gaze went blank as he stared at the hollow before him, the sword edging closer. Is that so? Then fine. Ichigo Kurosaki can die with you for all I care. They can both rot in hell. His sword came back once more, raised up to the sky. And then he swung, light appearing all around him as he did. The blade stopped an instant before it was too late, coming close to decapitating the woman who had suddenly appeared between him and Baragan. In front of him Nozomi merely returned the shocked look he was sending her with one of worry, not even concerned about the massive blade almost pressing against her neck. Nozomi? What are you? He paused at the sight of the energy forming around them, seeing it take shape into a familiar yet smaller form. Renzen, Hajukwari. He recognized the name Nozomi said. Combined with the fact he realized her weapon was stabbed into the ground behind him from a quick glance, he knew what this was even before the barrier completed and encircled them. It was a legendary spell. Her legendary spell to be precise. What are you doing, Nozomi? He knew he sounded a hell of a lot colder now. But considering she had just placed a barrier between him and Baragan, one keeping him in, he felt like this was the right kind of reaction to have. Let me out. You need to stop this. I said let me out, Nozomi. And I'm telling you that you need to stop this. Ichigo sighed for a moment. And then his gaze went even colder, as did his tone. I am giving you an order, Nozomi. Take down this barrier. Now. No. His fist slammed into the wall of the barrier right behind her. He could feel it struggle underneath the weight of his fist, but it held strong, repairing itself quickly the moment his fist came back. Take it down now or I will smash my way out of here, whether you want me to or not. It'll take you time if you do it that way. I compressed this barrier for a reason. You'd shatter a hole in it if I didn't. In here, you don't have nearly enough room to build up the kind of speed you'd need to perform the same feat. I'd say you'd need at least a solid minute punching it repeatedly to break free. Maybe less with your sword, but if you want to use that in here then you'll have to cut me down first. Which would in turn bring down the barrier instantly, Ichigo stated, grabbing her by the shoulder and slamming her against the barrier wall, his sword resting against her neck. Take it down. Or I will kill you. He hadn't expected to see the defiant look shot back at him, nor the words that followed. You won't do that. I know you won't. You want to bet your life on that. His head gestured towards Baragan. Your life in order to take his. All I have to do is kill one person and then I can ensure millions live by removing that monster from the world. Tell me, why wouldn't I do such a thing? If you think those words frighten me, they don't, Nozomi stated. I'm not afraid of you right now. Not at all. Because I've seen you cry at taking even a single life to try and save another. Which is how I know you won't kill me. I'll do it, Ichigo stated. If it means destroying him, I'll kill you. It seems you are quite busy right now, Baragan stated before Nozomi could respond, Ichigo's gaze snapping up towards him. I guess we have no choice but to reconvene enough time. Maybe you'll manage to kill me then, but until that day I suppose it's only fair to offer a parting gift. From the empty sleeves of Baragan's cloak, purple mist spread out, surrounding the barrier and creeping up its surfaces as it prepared to completely enclose them. Until we next meet Ichigo Kurosake, if that is still who you are then. I guess we'll find out soon. Don't you dare leave. Ichigo roared, releasing his grip on Nozomi and slamming his fist against the barrier once again. It continued to hold, even as the mist spread further upwards until Baragan disappeared from his sight. And yet he could still sense the same energy nearby. So long as he hurried, he could still catch up. But he could only do that if this barrier dropped quickly, and there was only one person who could do that. Take the barrier down. I told you no. Are you insane? He asked, slamming his fist against the barrier once more. Bring it down. I don't understand how it hasn't crumbled already. His magic ages things. Nozomi nodded. Baragan's time magic is pretty deadly. So preparing for that, I thought it would be best to create a countermeasure. It was tough to do on such short notice, but since I had a small area to cover, I was able to interweave spatial magic into the spell. For all intents and purposes, we are in an isolated space. Time magic and spatial magic tend to be pretty bad at directly affecting one another, and so the mist here can't get a grip on my barrier to age it. And what about when it finally does come down? Nozomi pointed at the sword he held, all the while rubbing her neck where the sword had been pressed against. I didn't just arrive. I've been watching for a while now, looking for the best time to step in. And then after that, I was trying to work out what you were doing. It's unfair to say I'm preventing you from killing Baragan when you have had the chance to do it over 700 times now. Ichigo scowled at her, taking a step forward angrily as if hoping it would intimidate her. But she didn't even try and back away, even if her back was to the edge of the barrier. I had the situation always under control. Baragan had no way to escape me. He was at my mercy for every moment of it. If he had shown the slightest indication that he was going to run, I would have cut off that option immediately. And now I can't. Because of you. His scowl dropped as he tilted his head towards where he could still sense Baragan. The hollow had been moving a bit, and just getting an extra meter away had filled him with a sense of urgency, but it felt like he had come to a stop. Why? Was he waiting for him to chase? What was that other magical power he could sense too? It felt like Mist Ogden. Close enough, Nozomi muttered softly, for the first time since she had appeared refusing to meet his eyes. I didn't jump in like this without a plan. I was to talk to you, but letting Baragan go during that time was inexcusable. It was the job of Mist Ogden to keep Baragan around until I was done. And you think Mist Ogden can handle Baragan? Ichigo asked. He knew the answer to that. Mist Ogden couldn't. He wasn't underestimating the man's skills, he knew them very well. And that was exactly why he knew Mist Ogden couldn't keep Baragan here. Even if Baragan was wounded, Mist Ogden was not strong enough. He'll die. He would have before, Nozomi agreed. But things have changed. And you did some significant damage to Baragan. If it's buying time, it's certainly doable now. Ichigo scowled again, debating his options for a moment before finally raising his sword for one final act of intimidation. Even so, I plan to not take any chances. Take down the barrier. Or I'll kill you. You won't. He tilted his head, doing his best to let nothing show as he took another step towards her. I'll ask you this once again. You want to bet your life on that? Right now I don't care if I add one more death to my conscience. Yes you do, she shot back at him. You, who cried over killing strangers you didn't know in the hopes of saving some of them, think you can kill someone as close as me? You, who hardened his heart in order to wait on saving your friends and family in Waiwaka's clutches as long as they were still safe in order to try and defeat him, think you can harden your heart enough to strike down someone you care about who isn't even armed? I think this barrier counts as you being armed. You ignored the question, she shot right back at him. Ichigo Kurosaki would not kill me. You aren't that kind of person. Ichigo Kurosaki won't, huh? His sword swung so fast that he knew she'd never be able to react in time. He even saw what would happen if he continued through with the strike, up until he saw the blade come to a stop right before her neck. Last chance. You say that, but it loses its impact the more times you do this, Nozomi stated. Before he knew what she was doing, she had reached out and gripped his blade with both hands, not caring about how blood started to leak out from the cuts as she pulled it against her neck and let it draw blood. Go on. If you can really do it, go ahead. You won't. It would be so easy to just push forward with the blade. He could still sense Baragan. If he got a bit further away, it could be trouble. He had to follow him now. But to do so, why not just do it? He knew what he had to do. So why not throw away the last bits holding him back here? Just a single push, needing so little force, and she'd be dead. The mist would be easy to get past, a single Getchuga with Mavis's magic would do that, and he'd cut down Baragan before the Hollow even knew what was going on. He could do it. He just had to kill her. And then all of this would end. And yet the moment he looked up and met her eyes, he felt that resolve shatter, slowly pulling his blade away from her neck and letting it fall to the ground beside them. Why are you doing this? He asked as he looked away. After having managed to gather the resolve to kill her, he couldn't look at her even if that resolve had broken. Why talk now? We could have done it after when Baragan was dead. We have to talk now precisely because Baragan isn't dead, Nozomi stated calmly. You're angry. And you've been taking so much of it out on Baragan. And you plan to kill him in anger too. And that's a problem. Shinji's dead. Yes, Shinji is dead, Nozomi said. Baragan killed him. That's what we all know. And yet you haven't ever said to us that Shinji was killed by him. You merely would say that he died. So I chose some different words. So what? Too many. Nozomi shrugged. Nothing. I won't pretend like it might have meant nothing. But I realized something important when you were fighting Baragan. If you were fighting for revenge, I could have understood it more clearly. But you played with him. You toyed with him. This wasn't about revenge or anger with him. You never toy with people like this. And you certainly don't torture such individuals. If they angered you, you would simply kill them in anger. Shinji is dead, Nozomi. I think I have the right to make Baragan suffer too. Yes, that was about making him suffer, wasn't it? Nozomi muttered, sounding as if she didn't believe him at all. I heard what he said. He didn't see what your eye was doing until his sight was restored. And he hadn't heard you keeping a tally of the number of times you could have killed him. How many other senses do you think he was missing? Because while he might have had to repair himself, he never seemed to show any signs of discomfort until he changed back. But it's true that you wanted someone to suffer, Nozomi added, staring at him pointedly. This show you did. It was for one person's sake. Your own. My own. Ichigo faked a laugh, but even to his ears it sounded hollow. So what? You think I'm trying to make myself suffer here, Nozomi? I thought you were smart, not stupid. Seriously, how could you have come to such a con dash? No matter what happens here today, Ichigo Kurosaki is dead. He froze at those words. Baragan said that, correct? And? He asked cautiously. What of it? You also seemed to react oddly to something I said. What was it again? Ichigo Kurosaki won't, huh? He snarled at her, slamming his fist against the barrier wall behind her once again. And? What of it? She sighed, glancing at his fist in what looked like disappointment. Even now you're still trying, aren't you? I said what of it? The one you want to make suffer is yourself. Myself. He slammed his fist again into the wall beside her, not even getting a flinch response. Your joke's gone on long enough, Nozomi. Open the barrier. I'm not joking, Nozomi stated calmly. I wasn't sure at first, but the more I watched and heard the more it became clear. Playing with your enemy to an excessive degree is not something Ichigo Kurosaki does. Torturing his enemy like that is not something Ichigo Kurosaka does. And most of all, killing allies is not something Ichigo Kurosaka does, or even considers an option. You wanted to do the last one but couldn't, but I can see what your intention was. You want the same thing as Baragan right now. For Ichigo Kurosaka to die. If you're trying to threaten me here talking about suicide and death dash. I'm not done yet, Nozomi stated as she interrupted him. You want yourself to suffer right now, you may even want yourself to die, and yet you can't give up willingly. You know if you die, many more will. You can't willingly throw your life away. So you want to at least die inside. If Ichigo Kurosaka doesn't exist, someone else can do the rest of the work. They can take all the burden and pain without the attachment. The shell that is left won't need to harden the heart because it won't have one. You would only need to do your job, uncaringly to the very end and unbound by anything of your old self. Am I wrong? Of course. He shouted. I'm doing this because I want to. Because I want vengeance for Shinji. Because I want this war to end. Because I. His words came to a halt as he noticed her eyes softening at his response, one hand reaching up and wiping away at something beneath his eye. Can you really say all that while crying? She asked softly, looking at him in concern. You don't need to pretend in front of me. I've already seen you like this before, when Zeref made you kill all those villagers. In the end, has anything changed here? The only difference is that it was Baragan who did this and that the level of pain is even greater. So please, she asked quietly. Don't keep lying to me. You want to kill Baragan still, right? Then stop lying. That's how you'll get me to remove the barrier. Fine then, Ichigo snarled. You want to know the truth? All right. I hate all of this. This war, these deaths. How many have already died? And for what? A magic that just so happened to bond to me. And of course those that wanted it had to be as strong as I am, Ichigo added angrily. But that wasn't enough. No, they didn't want to fight me one-on-one. If necessary I would have fought them all together if it meant avoiding this. But they didn't want that. So they gathered armies, all for the sake of killing me. So I did what was necessary, he continued, not realizing he had removed his fist from the barrier's surface and had backed away a few steps. It was my fault the war began, because I was too strong to be killed easily, so they decided to do this the hard way. So I did what was necessary. I fought where I was needed, did what I could, and still people died. Makarov died in the first few days of the war, and despite our issues in the past I always saw him as a good man. Yuzua, Kelia, Wendy, Gildarts, they all were trapped in Waiwaka's clutches for a month. I told myself that it was fine. That they would be safe, because the time necessary would give us a chance to think of a plan to beat Waiwaka with the intel we'd get from Uriah. He snarled again, pressing one hand against his head in frustration. But we failed. I failed. I couldn't kill Waiwaka, lost the absorb to him, and was responsible for him regaining his full power. I lost the old man that day, Yuzo lost any ability to be a mage again, had to have Kelia mentally turned back to our side by her own friend, and barely avoided any other casualties that day. Those aren't even the extent of the pain people have been brought because of me, he growled out angrily as he continued. If I hadn't been so focused on trying to keep back my true Bankai for the future, in preparation for fighting the other Ukin, I could have leveled Tartaros myself. With that speed and strength, I could have blown it all away. It doesn't matter if I couldn't control it properly because no one else would have had to die that day. And instead who knows how many fell to the demons. Levi ended up permanently injured because I brought her along, and day by day she is looking more and more like her future self. Meanwhile Laxus is being forced to make tough decisions to avoid that same fate, becoming more and more like a dragon every day because I took him and Natsu out of the safety of the barrier and straight into the line of fire with Acknowledge. And it's not just my friends who get dragged into this mess, he muttered. Those villagers were innocent. What crime did they commit for Zeref to use them like that? None. He wanted to hurt me, and me alone. So I cut every one of them down in the foolish hope that perhaps I could save a single one of them. But I can't. He shouted, cradling his head in both hands now. Again and again, everything just slips through my fingers. They're so coated with blood that I can't even grasp anything anymore. The more precious it is, the more it'll break in my hands. I thought Shinji would be safe with me, and look what happened. From the start Baragan wanted him there, so he would die as a result of my actions. No matter what I try, no matter how much I try to do the right thing, no matter how much I try to protect things, it always ends the same way. Don't you understand? Ichigo Kurosaka can't protect anything. And if I can't protect anything, if I can't save anyone. He let his hands drop to his sides, looking down at the ground at seeing his own reflection in his blade beside him. If I can't save anyone, then why should I even exist like this? He muttered softly. Someone like that isn't needed. So I'll disappear. I'll become someone else. Everything that makes me up can vanish. It didn't help anyone. It didn't save anyone. So it can all shatter with me. Whatever is left can at least keep the enemy at bay. Looking at his reflection, he found himself laughing briefly. It was a dry laugh, not one of amusement but of regretful acceptance. Mest probably will recognize me when I return. I know the future versions of Levi and Laxus certainly will. I'm sure the person I'll become is the person they know. But I can't change the future away from that now. I'll stop fighting it. I can't find the will to resist it anymore. I hate myself too much to do that now. He didn't hearing anything from Nozomi as he finally quieted down. He couldn't blame her for that, however. Not many people would know what to say to him. Her silence was fine, so long as she opened the barrier. I've told you the truth. Now op dash. What am I? He frowned, glancing up at her. He wasn't sure what expression it was that she was showing right now. It looked sad, but there was also understanding in that. And anger. She was mad? I said, what am I? You're Nozomi. Are you dash? That's not what I'm talking about, she stated, pressing a hand against her chest for emphasis. What am I? I don't know. He didn't even understand what she was asking. Why was she so mad? You said you couldn't save anyone. So what am I then? You can hardly call that saving you, he stated. I helped you. Some else could have dash. No one could have. She declared, closing the distance between them and grabbing him by the front of his shirt. If left alone, I would have died. I was in a new world, one that I had never been in before and had no desire to be in. My only friends were dimensions away, trapped beyond my reach forever. I could have survived, but I wouldn't have lived. Because I had nothing to live for. Except you. You were the only thing familiar to me, she muttered, slightly calmer than before but still gripping his shirt tightly. The only thing that actual mattered once I was close to you. Even if I had lost everything, there was still one tiny ray of light left. I was not completely alone. Because of that I was able to stand up again and find reasons to keep going. And it wasn't only me. Mistogen followed you for so long because he adored you. Everyone else in the world was abandoning him and yet you still held out a hand. He was seeking a way to live and you saved him by allowing him that chance. Do you know how much that meant to him that day? How thankful he was to you for being saved. I can name more, she added quietly. I've heard the tales on Tenro Island. You fought to try and protect everyone, defeating the man who had destroyed the great Tenro tree and later battling Acknowledge to try and buy everyone else time. And even in defeat, you saved them all with Fairies' sphere. You fought against the dragons in Crocus, drawing the majority of their numbers towards you so that they could survive. How many did you save by taking on the full force of the dragons? The future changed tremendously from the one Mest came from because thousands upon thousands of people lived past that day. And even before all of this, you saved people when you could. Taoshiro would have died alone, starving in a frozen wasteland. Shinji would have taken his last breath in a lab, killed by the very man who experimented on him. Go back even further. What would have happened if you had never killed Poison Viper? That doesn't matter, Ichigo shot out. Because I did that dash. Because you did that, Nozomi stated, you saved the people they would have killed. And as a result, Shinji is now dead. Nozomi nodded. It is true. But that's on Baragan. Baragan. No, it's on me. If I hadn't saved him. That's funny, she muttered softly, looking up at him as he fell silent. I thought you said you hadn't saved anyone. I understand though, Nozomi muttered. You're in pain. You feel like you are responsible for this war, and so you bear that burden like a cross. In your mind, every death is a result of your actions. And people like Ziref and Baragan only make it worse. Because they exploit that. They see you buckling under the pressure and try to break you completely. Baragan's actions here are the clearest example of that, Nozomi pointed out. It's certainly true that they aren't based on some master plan to win this war. From the very start, it has always been about you. Hundreds of thousands died to the Hollows, all as part of Baragan's elaborate plan to draw you to him. And Shinji's death was the result of all that work. This wasn't about killing some valuable mage or about someone bravely dying in the field of battle. Baragan knew that would never hurt you in the way he wanted because all of us accept the fact that death is inevitable in war. He couldn't break you with a mere casualties, no matter how numerous they might be. So he didn't do that, she added. This was completely and utterly personal. This wasn't some random act to strike someone down, nor was it a result of two strong enemies clashing and our side losing. This was a result of Baragan choosing and actively working towards killing one of our own, from the very beginning. And it wasn't because of some strategic value he might obtain or some grudge with Shinji himself. This is all because Shinji was your friend. Then it's my fault. Nozomi shook her head. No. It's not. I think you do understand what Baragan wanted, but you are too hurt right now to care. What Baragan did is why this is so cruel to witness and why you are struggling to bear that pain. Because the only reason Shinji was even targeted was because of you. You are aware of this, Baragan ensured you would be, and now that knowledge is killing you inside. In your mind, you are probably replaying the same scene over and over again, unable to forget the moment in which he died, and know that no matter what you think, one thing won't change. If Shinji had never met you, he would never have been targeted in this way. But you seem to forget something very important, Nozomi stated, a soft smile appearing on her face as she forced him to meet her eyes. There wasn't just pain from such a meeting. If you think Shinji would have been happier for even a moment if he had never met you, I'm afraid you'd be wrong. You were family to him, family that he loved. And it's the same with those still alive and breathing. You're so afraid of us being used and hurt because of you that you are willing to break yourself to prevent there being any more casualties. So that no one else would be hurt. But there would be, she whispered, quiet enough that he had to strain his ears to hear her. No matter what you think, people will be hurt even if you break. If you become nothing more than a machine, acting and doing a duty you have lost the will to care about, how many of your friends will cry like I'd want to? How many would try and pull you back only to find out it is useless? How much of their heart would they have to expose to you only to realize those words aren't even being recognized? Carefully releasing her grip on him, Nozomi took a step away and stepped towards the barrier, leaving him frozen where he still was. But I guess you are still confused, right? So I just need to show you. Show me. Nozomi nodded, her hand brushing against the handle of her weapon and holding it tightly. If you kill Baragan right now, you'll regret it. You'll destroy yourself in the process because you'll never be able to come to peace with everything. If the root of this is the belief that you cannot save anyone, then I will prove to you that you can. If what pushed you over the edge is losing someone to Baragan, then you simply need to protect the next person. Nozomi. What are you doing? Ichigo felt himself freeze at the sight of her, a small smile across her face filled with more emotion than he had ever seen her shown to him. It may be foolish, but we all do foolish things for those we love. But perhaps that is why we can have such blind faith. No matter what happens, even if it brings us pain or death, we can still love those people regardless. Wait, hold on. Don't do it. She simply continued to smile on him, even as she pulled her weapon from the ground, her legendary spell collapsing around them and releasing the mist inwards towards them. As I love you. Protector of the fairies. A protector that wishes to save someone. As the barrier that made up her legendary spell broke apart, for a brief moment Nozomi wondered if she had made a mistake. Ichigo would try to save her. She knew he would, because that was the kind of person he was. He wouldn't be able to watch her die without trying to prevent it. No, what she was worried about was if she had miscalculated. She had been by the barrier's edge, which had been the only thing acting as a buffer between her and the mist beyond. Mist that would need only a single touch to turn her body to ash. And while she had seen Ichigo fight, there was still such a tiny distance between her and the mist that he would need to get her away from. Could he close the gap in time? He was faster than the mist, but he had to cross a much greater distance. Even with his speed, it was risky. And there was still the matter of dealing with the mist surrounding them. He could pull her away, but could he protect her in time and disperse the mist? The energy that could repel it appeared to be concentrated in his Zanpakuto, and had been released in bursts of energy either similar to his Getsuga Ten's house or simply enhancing the existing move. In order to utilize that power, Ichigo would need his sword. She was sure of that. But that same sword was lying on the ground beside Ichigo. He had to not only grab his sword but also pull her away in time. Even being a second late could be no good if he didn't reach her in time. And that wasn't even considering if the energy might actually harm her. A Getsuga was still a Getsuga, even if altered, and she wasn't immune to his magic. There was a slight possibility that the only way out would be for him to fire off a blast all around him to destroy the mist, which in turn could hurt her. If she died, or if Ichigo hurt her in his attempts to pull her to safety, then all of this would have been for nothing. If she had miscalculated his chances of success, she could very well have been the final push needed for him to turn completely away from everyone and to destroy himself. As the last fragments of his spell continued to vanish, the mist shot in through the holes made in it, breaking through the pre-existing areas in some cases. Without being in a complete state, she had no way to run her spatial magic through the spell. Without that, the barrier might as well have been paper thin. The mist drew in closer, crossing the short distance faster than she could blink, and for that brief moment she prayed to whoever might be listening that she hadn't been wrong. The next moment of consciousness that she managed to pick up on was her body being dragged back, cradled carefully with one arm as if the one carrying her was afraid she'd break if they weren't careful. A sword flashed briefly, golden light blinding her eyes for a moment and making her blink rapidly as she tried to recover her lost vision. The world around her seemed to shift rapidly, and when she opened her eyes she could see the mist that had threatened to kill her far away in the distance. Glancing over at her savior, she let a knowing smile grow across her face. "I knew you wouldn't let me die." Ichigo didn't respond to that. Instead his eyes seemed to be glancing over every inch of her, before finally latching onto her arm as they narrowed. She wasn't sure why he was reacting so harshly to begin with, until she actually took a look at her arm. It was still there, thankfully. But near her right elbow, the sleeve had been worn away and was revealing where fresh skin should have been. Instead it looked older, almost like it didn't fit on her body. Like it was out of sync with her, and like it had been burnt away at the edges. Ah! The mist had made contact, hadn't it? That was the only thing that could explain it. She had been a step too close in the end, and had almost paid the price for that. She shouldn't have been so melodramatic with her actions near the end. Not when it almost ruined what had been a successful plan besides this one detail. Still, she was alive and pretty much unhurt in the grand schemes of things. But was that good enough? Glancing at Ichigo, she hoped looking at his face would give her some kind of answer. If it didn't, perhaps she could read something from his body language instead. "What were you thinking?" he asked as she looked back up, fury crossing his face. "Of all the most idiotic things you could have done. What if I had been too slow? What if I hadn't made it in time?" "I had faith," she merely responded. There was no point telling him she had been afraid for a brief moment. That would only make his reaction worse. "After seeing you fight dash. You think that gives you enough of an idea to work out how fast I'll be? You couldn't track me in my fake Bankai, so what made you think you could accurately predict my speed here? You'd hardly be able to tell the difference between the two." Nozomi nodded. "Even so, I had faith." After the displays she had seen, the close shaves that Ichigo had managed to avoid when he moved in his Bankai, she had been almost certain on the speed he possessed, even if she herself could not properly track him. "I didn't believe you would let me die. It's not a matter of me letting you or not," he exclaimed, his grip on her tightening as something else made its way into his eyes. It took her a moment to actually recognize it. His hatred and pain had blocked out a lot of what he usually showed, but this was an expression she had grown to know familiarly. The version of Ichigo in Yukio's dream world had shown a similar expression quite often near the end. What if I moved as fast as I could and still didn't make it? I barely did, and if it wasn't for Mavis's power then you'd be gone. This isn't a game. I don't think it is. She exclaimed back, annoyed at the very idea that he thought she was treating this like a game. It was a calculated risk that I believed was necessary. If things had stayed as they were, nothing would have changed. We'd still be going around in circles in my barrier, getting nowhere at all. Ichigo frowned for a moment, his anger slowly fading away from his eyes. She wondered if he had even realized he was still holding her with one arm, his grip hard to break. Luckily she only had to struggle for a brief moment for him to notice, his grip coming loose as he let her stand on her own 2 feet. Thanks. Ichigo scoffed at her, his head turning away. Thanks for what? For saving you from your own foolishness. She couldn't help but smile at those words, unsettling Ichigo a bit as she leaned in closer and pointed a finger at him. Say it again. I'm sorry. You heard me, she stated, leaning back and placing her hands on her hips defiantly. Say it again. Ichigo frowned at her. She could tell he was running over what he had said before, trying to work out what was causing her to act like this. She could see the answer come to him perfectly too, the moment in which his eyes widened briefly and how his gaze seemed to try and look anywhere but at her. Go on. Say it again. He mumbled something, likely what she had been after. But that wasn't enough for her. She needed to be sure he was acknowledging this, and also had to be sure he wasn't trying to make an excuse or anything. But above all else, she had to engrave the words she knew were needed to be heard into his heart and soul. Say it louder. This time she could make out some of the words. Louder, she repeated. She wasn't going to accept a half-hearted response like this. So I can hear you. For saving you from your own foolishness, Ichigo finally said, keeping her waiting for a few seconds as he stumbled over words she was sure he was trying his best to pretend didn't exist right now. But I dash. No buts, Nozomi said as she cut him off. She wouldn't let him make an excuse for this. No matter how the danger had been caused, even if it had been her own intention to put herself in a dangerous situation, the fact was that he had still moved in time to save her. The circumstances around that didn't matter. This was going better than she had wanted admittedly. She hadn't pulled him back yet, but no longer was he at the edge about to dive in. He was hesitating. Or perhaps it was more accurate to say that he was fighting against himself. The desire to destroy himself, to bring about the death of Ichigo Kurosaka to save himself from any more pain, and the desire to keep fighting, one that had been buried deep by Baragan's actions under pain and rage. By ensuring she saved him, she had essentially uncovered that desire once again. If left alone, he could fall either way. She just had to make sure he fell the right way. Let me guess. You think because I manipulated you into saving me that it doesn't count. That was the crux of the matter, she reckoned. In the end, that fact was true. The situation she engineered was one that took advantage of the fact that Ichigo would not allow her to die without a fight. He would try to save her so long as there was still a fragment of a chance. But the very need to try and save her arose from her purposefully putting herself in harm's way. Because she knew how he would act, she had ensured he would act as she wanted. But then at its core, that was entirely the point. And she made sure he knew that as she spoke. I manipulated you. I made you save me. This situation, the way the event would go down, it was planned by me. It might not have been a long plan, nor very elaborate, but it was one that made you save me. And you think it means that it doesn't count if you saved me? He was hesitating. Just a bit further now. But then it's that the same thing Baragan did, isn't it? His eyes snapped towards her, his previous hesitation at meeting her gaze completely gone. What did you say? Baragan manipulated you, she replied, meeting his own gaze without flinching. He needed to hear this. And there would be no better time to ensure he did than now. He engineered a whole plan that involved making you play to his tune. He knew how to draw you in, how to make you hurt, and finally how to break you. You claim Shinji's death is your fault as a result. Is that correct? Yes. Then what is the difference between my plan and his? She asked. She could see the confusion beginning to appear across his face. He didn't understand yet. But she would ensure he did by the end of this. Between my plan and his, there are only a few differences. Scale, time, and purpose. The first two are heavily linked with Baragan. He prepared a plan to manipulate you perfectly over all the years he had to wait. I had much less time to work with. Then there is purpose. Baragan wanted you to believe you were incapable of saving people, that you would only bring them pain and death. But mine? It was to do the opposite. To show that not everything you touch dies or breaks. To that end, she added, I manipulated you just like he did. We both desired you to respond in a certain way. So tell me why saving me doesn't count if Shinji's death does? Both were a result of manipulation. Both were started due to the actions of foreign parties desiring something different from you. She was getting through to him. She could see it. Just one final push. I understand that you want to run away from this pain, she stated calmly. I know you're hurting. That Baragan made you feel this way. But that is exactly why I had to force you to see what he didn't want you to. In Baragan's eyes, you have nothing but flaws, so he wanted you to see only that. He wanted you to see yourself the same way he did. But I won't let you. I won't let you forget that there is far more to you than what a single hollow thinks, no matter how powerful it is. He seemed to go quiet as she finished, his mouth opening a few times as if to say something before growing quiet. It even seemed like he was struggling to say something for a moment, and she was about to ask him what was the matter when he interrupted his thoughts with a few words. Can I really still do it? She had him. Those few words were enough to fill her with joy. If she had failed, he wouldn't have even cared to ask the question. But he did. Merely asking it was a sign that he was being pulled back. Now all that mattered was how she would respond. There were hundreds of ways she could reply to him, all saying the same thing but in more elegant or impressive sounded ways. But really there was only one word she needed that was greater than any of them. Yes, she replied honestly. No other words were needed. He didn't need to hear a big explanation or details on what he could do. All he needed to hear was a simple word, a simple answer, to keep on going. His face brightened slightly for a brief moment, the faintest traces of a smile finally reappearing before her eyes. He tried to hide it, to suppress it, but it didn't change the fact that she had seen it. He wasn't gone. She wished she could give him more time to relish in such a moment, to finally see a glimpse of himself once again, but unfortunately time was not kind to them right now. We can talk more later if you wish, but right now there is a more pressing matter you need to deal with. Miss Dogan will be unable to hold Baragan in place indefinitely. You should hurry. Ichigo frowned as he turned in the direction of Baragan, shooting her a questioning look. You'll let me go like this? How are you so sure I won't break now by killing Baragan? You wouldn't, she stated with absolute confidence. The one trying to kill Baragan wanted nothing more than for Ichigo Kurosaki to be swallowed up by pain and to disappear. Killing Baragan would have doomed you like that to the life of a husk. But now you have light again. Things to give you clarity. No matter what happens from here, you won't lose your purpose by killing Baragan. So go. Finish this as Ichigo Kurosaki, whoever Ichigo Kurosaki is to you now. If you can't forget the pain, then just make sure you don't forget the joy too. So long as you have that, so long as you have the will to protect people rather than just destroy, you will still be Ichigo Kurosaki. In my mind, that is what matters the most. I think. I understand, Ichigo muttered softly as he turned back to her. Then, without giving her time to think, he pulled her into a one-armed hug. It took her a moment to register what was happening, and then another for her to carefully return the gesture. He was warm. Had the version of him in the dream world felt like this too? Illusions became reality in that world, but they were still only illusions. It was confusing as she compared the experiences she was having now to the ones she had in there. But in some of the cases so far, she was starting to see how the real world could be more pleasant, even if it wasn't as peaceful or perfect. Thank you. I told you already, it's dash. Not about that, Ichigo said as he cut her off. For not giving up on me. For trying to reach out to me. For saving me. I wouldn't say I saved you so much. You did, Ichigo stated, more confidently now. You stopped me from doing something I might regret. I was willing to destroy myself to find any kind of peace. But you didn't want me to disappear. You reached me in my closed-off world and pulled me out of the darkness. No one asked you to. I didn't want you to. But you did it anyway. With all my heart and soul. Thank you. His grip slacked on her and she reluctantly allowed him to back away. Get away from here as fast as you can. I am going to go end this and I can't risk anyone getting caught up in the blast. I won't play around with Baragan any further. She wanted to argue that she'd be fine if she watched from nearby, but she decided not to argue against that right now. There was no point derailing his resolve right after managing to get it back on track. Miss Doggin will move quickly when you show up. Don't worry about him. Honestly, it wouldn't be too bad if Jalal did get caught up in the blast, she thought privately to herself. He had helped her out by coming here, but he was still hardly on the level of what she might call trust. You're sure you'll be fine now? If I'm not, then I'm sure you'll stop me again, right? He joked. That was good, she thought. If he could make jokes like that now, it meant he was in a better place than before. His gaze turned briefly towards a spot in the distance she didn't recognize, something that must have stood there before the battle tore it to shreds, before he sighed and turned back to Baragan. Time to finally end this. Protector of the fairies. What was that? Muttered Jalal, briefly glancing over towards where Baragan had come from. Did her barrier collapse? The thought was, admittedly, slightly worrying. Neither of the two over there were truly his friends. But they had been important to Miss Doggin, and that left traces. It even made him slightly concerned. Not enough for him to leave his post, however. Whatever was going on over there, it mattered little in the face of his current task. Keeping Baragan here. It was hard. He had all his magical power and had the freedom to use it as he pleased. It was the first time since he had been freed that he was able to fight exactly as he wanted, with the spells he desired to cast ready at his fingertips at a moment's notice. And yet, it wasn't enough. The problem wasn't in his strength, but his opponent's. After the beating Baragan had taken, the damage the Hollow had been forced to endure, to the point he was forced out of his second resurrection, he had expected to find the Hollow weak and easy to corral. The Hollow was sure to be running low on magical power. Unfortunately, the two of them had different ideas of how much low was. Baragan's second resurrection must have taken a massive amount of magical power to maintain for long periods of time, as the amount of magical power the Hollow had now, not enough to call back that power, was still equal to his own full state, if not greater. Add on the fact that the Hollow could replenish his magical power even more given enough time, and his job was made even harder, as only one of them would truly lose energy if it came to a battle of attrition. To make matters worse, Baragan had somehow managed to reattach the arms he had seen Ichigo sever, even if they looked thinner than before. Fighting an enemy without arms would have been much easier than fighting one who could reattach their severed arms, but at least it seemed to have repercussions. From their one clash he had managed to realize that the arms truly were weaker physically, and at this point only served to help Baragan direct his magic more easily. And that was enough to make the Hollow a significant threat once again. To keep Baragan focused on him here and to actually pose a threat to the Hollow, he had needed to think smartly. He had to have full control of the fight and not give Baragan a chance to react. And for that, he had needed to be unafraid of pouring out every last drop of magic he could in this fight. It didn't matter if he couldn't fight for long. He didn't need to. He merely needed to do his job and leave the rest to others. As mist spread towards him, released in a large arc from Baragan's hand being swung, he darted back to create some space before shooting upwards over the encouraging danger. So long as his meteor spell held strong, he didn't have much to fear from the mist so long as he was careful. He had the speed to outrun it and had full run of the sky, even if Baragan had the same. The only danger would be if the mist did make contact. Even the tiniest piece would rip his spell to shreds, and then move on to him too. The mist was also serving to make some of his setup more tiring than it needed to be. Creating magic circles in the air was easy, but they were also fragile. Against Baragan's power, they would shatter even from glancing blows, and the mist just tore them to pieces as it passed. So before Baragan could release any more mist, he had to act and take advantage to fill the sky with them. Pushing his meteor spell to its max, he darted back and forth, both hands quickly working to trace out the symbols needed from his magic with each pass. As Baragan began to raise his hand once more, he knew his time was up. Even so, the 40 small magic circles he had were enough. They surrounded Baragan from all sides in the sky, closing off any avenues of escape. Starfall. Beams of light shot out of each circle in mass as Baragan swung out, purple mist exploding out in all directions. Backing away rapidly as it approached like a wave, Jalal let his spell continue until the last moment before cutting the connection it had to his magic, just in time before the mist devoured them all. It hadn't advanced as quickly as before he noticed. So his hypothesis was correct. Baragan could only produce the mist at a certain rate, and the generation of more helped accelerate the mist outwards. Covering all angles had made it much slower than it was in slices or focused waves. The knowledge didn't offer much help, however. Having Baragan trapped in a bubble of his magic made him almost inaccessible. He'd have to remember to avoid attacking from too many sides to allow himself openings to strike from. But until then, first he had to try and exhaust some of that mist. Something heavy might do the trick, large enough that it would require a lot of Baragan's power to combat the force. The stance was easy to make, even in the air. Were the others nearby far enough away? He'd have to just assume here and hope they weren't caught in the blast radius. With his spear strapped on his back, he let his left hand point downwards while extending his index and middle fingers. His right hand mirrored the action before being dragged up in an arc, pointed at the sky above. He could already feel the winds picking up around him and the large loss of magical power this spell took from him. Far above, the energy began to take shape, hiding within the swirling clouds that were only getting worse as time passed. He could feel the cloak he had chosen to wear, one of those impressive magic sealing cloaks the others possessed, being pulled back and forth behind him as the wind increased, the drain on his magic becoming more noticeable as the first glimpses of light began to appear through the clouds. Was this enough magical power yet? He spared a glance at the amount of mist Baragan had before shaking his head. No, it wouldn't be. He had to ensure a threat appeared that took Baragan's full attention. And for that end, he pushed even more magic into his spell and let the orb above continue to grow to greater sizes. With the magic needed beginning to reach its peak, he let out a smirk as he swiped his right hand back down, the signal the spell used to begin its descent. Sema. What fell from the sky above was gigantic, large enough that it would flatten them both easily along with the entire surrounding area from the shockwave it would produce. No matter how Baragan might try, there was no way the hollow would be able to tank such a hit. The injuries it would cause would be too severe. So naturally Baragan moved to protect himself. The hollow did wait longer than he had expected, almost making him think that it had something up its sleeves, but eventually a hand was raised up towards the incoming danger, all the mist present being pulled upwards and slamming straight into the falling meteor. It was almost impressive to watch, he noticed as he shot downwards, fascinated in watching how the mist slowly began to eat away at the meteor's surface. He was sure that not a single bit of his spell would manage to break it though, but that didn't matter. Because Baragan could only keep this going so long as he continued to focus on using the mist above him and not anywhere else. Landing quickly on the ground behind Baragan, he knew he had little time to act before the hollow retaliated. So he struck as quickly as he could, swiping upwards with his right hand and forming 6 rays of light across the arc. Pleiades. Typically this spell was used for bombardment purposes, firing each shot one after the other and forcing an opponent to retreat under each consecutive attack. Here, he had another idea in mind. Rather than firing the beams upwards first, he let them shot downwards and had the first slam upwards into Baragan's chest. The result was just as he wanted. From the blow Baragan was lifted off the ground slightly, and the rest of the 5 remaining rays of light wasted no time in following the first. Each blow knocked Baragan up higher and higher, pushing him towards his own mist and the encroaching meteor. If he couldn't get the meteor through the mist, then he'd simply bring the caster up through it instead. Baragan quickly worked out what he was after, however. While one hand was still held up to hold the mist in place and replenish it, there was still another free. With it Baragan pressed it up against the air as the last of the rays hit him, the arm bending under some invisible strain before Baragan came to abrupt stop. Had the hollow made a platform in the air above his hand's palm to stop his momentum? He had been so close to. Oh well. He'd just hit the hollow with something harder and break that weak platform he was clinging to. Leaping up after Baragan, he held out his arm behind him before dragging it back along in an arc, 9 swords made out of a mixture of light and crackling lightning forming in the air. Dualizing. With a final swipe forward, all 9 blades were released from the air and shot forward, converging on their target. At the last moment, however, Baragan brought down his arm, platforms created beneath his feet to stand on now, and poured mist out from his palm. Not one of his swords made it, but choosing to block had its repercussions too. The mist above that had been holding the meteor back wasn't enough anymore, and large chunks of earth began to rain down through the gaps they could squeeze through while the rest was eaten away. Such dangers weren't a problem in Jalal's mind as he darted around the area, taking cover for brief moments behind falling rock that was quickly bombarded by Baragan's mist. Eyeing the falling pieces heading towards Baragan, he timed his chance to shoot back out and towards the hollow as it went to destroy the danger. With energy glowing around his palm, he prepared to slam it straight into Baragan's chest before suddenly noticing the formation of mist, pulling back just in time as the threat sprung out. It didn't relent easily, forcing him to shoot back rapidly as he made to outrun it. In the process, however, he grabbed his spear off his back and threw it forward, allowing the aura of his meteor spell that he wrapped around it to remain and help him guide it. With a small swipe he had it dart around the mist as it continued to chase him, using his speed to keep moving and to clearly watch Baragan and his weapon. The spear darted from cover to cover thanks to his control, doing his best to keep it out of Baragan's line of sight. He was glad he hadn't let it charge in yet when Baragan fired a zero upwards at the falling pieces of meteor, blowing them all away and even tearing out a massive chunk of the rest of the meteor above. Without missing the chance he saw, he took advantage of the light from the zero and fired his spear straight towards it, the weapon shooting straight though the fading remains. It narrowly missed the hollow's chest as Baragan dodged to one side, but with a flick of his hand he had the spear immediately spin round in the air and shoot straight back. Baragan dodged again, but not without the spear taking away a chunk of bone from his shoulder. A third attack would have been tried if not for the expanding mist from Baragan's body as he abandoned offensive and focused on defending himself. Sighing in annoyance, Jalal summoned the spear back to him, allowing it to take the shortest path possible and land in his outstretched hand. With a glance at the meteor, he guessed that there was about a sixth of it left, and with it gone Baragan would be free to use his mist freely once again. If he wanted to get a strong hit in, now was really going to be his chance. Would his Grand Chariot spell be enough? It might do some serious damage, but only if he could ensure the mist wasn't used as a barrier against it. Still, it would be quite obvious. Perhaps there was a better way to do this. Moving quickly while there was still pieces of meteor falling, he flew down towards Baragan, ducking and weaving around the debris. As he passed behind each piece of falling rock, he moved quickly to inscribe a magic circle across its surface, taking care to keep his actions hidden from Baragan. As he passed the first few he made sure to throw his spear forward, directing it as he continued to work and having it keep Baragan occupied. In between darting from each piece of earth he made sure to fire off rays of light, bombarding Baragan's position as much as possible to keep the hollow occupied on him and only him. "These pathetic attempts of yours are pointless," Baragan declared as he swung his arm out, a mass amount of mist spreading out from the hollow's palm and shooting straight towards him. With a smirk, he darted back as he purposefully led the mist back, his spear coming with him to prevent it being destroyed. With this, all of Baragan's awareness would be on him. So he doubted the hollow would even think to check for any surprises until it was too late. So with a swipe of his hand, all the magic circles that he had inscribed on the falling pieces of debris activated. He doubted Baragan was aware of what heavenly body magic was capable of. From his display so far, one would assume it was star-related in many cases, linked to light for the most part. And like all those fools, he was sure Baragan hadn't considered the fact that his magic could also allow him to manipulate gravity. From each magic circle, gravity magic surged out. It was the simplest application out there, merely the addition of a new force to act as propulsion, but simple was all he needed here. Some of the meteor fragments went shooting off in random directions, a danger he had been aware of due to being unable to accurately predict how the pieces might land and roll when they hit the ground. But the majority fired just as planned, directly towards Baragan from all sides. When it looked like he finally might have managed to make contact with the spell, he watched those hopes get destroyed. Mist burst forth from Baragan's body, slamming into every projectile he fired and destroying them all. It was only the sight from above that preventing it from affecting him though. While the meteor was mostly destroyed, there were still 2 large chunks of it left, formed as what little mist remained up above split the original down the middle. In Baragan's haste to defend himself, it seemed the hollow had stripped away too much power from above them. Throwing his spear back, he directed it away as it darted up into the sky. Then, placing his hands over one another, he let a large magic circle form over them as he rose it towards the sky. All the nearby shadows were drawn upwards as the spell began to form, a large black orb appearing in the center of the magic circle. Before it could let it fully form, he got to work with modifying it as fast as he could. One thing, more than anything, was needed here. Gravity magic. All he needed was the pulling force that would come as the orb tried to draw everything into itself. Alta Iris. Swinging his arms back down, he launched the black orb forward towards Baragan. Immediately a difference was made around them as suddenly the 2 large fragments of the meteor immediately began to increase in speed towards them, being pulled towards the gravity of the orb. Even the mist of Baragan's magic was being drawn in, unable to damage the orb enough before it was destroyed within the mass of magic hiding within. Now he had to move. He pushed everything he had into his meteor spell and tried to dart away. It wasn't easy at all, not when the very force pulling the meteor's remains in was also trying to drag him back too. Forcefully expelling magic from his feet as quickly as he could with the spell to act as greater propulsion, he was rewarded with a brief burst of speed as he shot out in a straight line from the spell. The moment he was free he spun back to look at Baragan, only to find the hollow raising both hands towards the meteor remains and the black orb he had made, all the while digging his feet into the air to prevent himself from being pulled in. Looking at Baragan's actions, he had expected more of the mist to appear. Instead what he got was a black orb of Baragan's own forming, tinted with purple at the edges. It wasn't a normal Zero, that he could tell from a glance. Which is why he didn't dare even try to stay in the line of fire of the spell. He doubted a normal Zero could break through all of this easily without losing power in the process. But this one just seemed to scream danger to him. No sooner had he done so had the blast fired, easily smashing through everything in its path and destroying both the spell and meteors in one fell swoop, and even covering the sky where he had been hovering in beforehand. Baragan still had that kind of power left? Seriously? How much magical power was he at right now? Damn. He could sense the Hollow's power, lower than before but now certainly greater than his own. Meanwhile for him, utilizing so many costly spells in quick succession, without pause, had taken its toll on him. He would still able to fight for some time but it was clear how the battle would go if things kept up. And it looked like Baragan was looking up at him, waiting for his next move. Well, there was a silver lining. Baragan had forgotten about something. Falling from the sky, the spear shot downwards, tearing through Baragan's left arm and ripping it off. He had hoped to hit the head but it seemed Baragan had noticed something at the last moment. Still, it was a victory he would take. Now he had to make sure Baragan didn't take the time to recover that arm. Flying down as fast as he could, he blasted off a few rays of light as he went, bombarding the area between his spear and Baragan to keep the Hollow at bay for just a few more moments. Mist shot out at him as he approached but he was too fast for it, shooting past and pulling the spear and arm up as he went. Then he got out of them immediately, darting back far enough away that he could easily react to any tricks Baragan tried while also making sure he could destroy the arm. A seal of self-destruction turned out to be the spell that immediately came to his mind for this purpose. He was sure he knew other spells that could destroy the arm but he still chose this one in the end, the seal encasing the arm entirely before it detonated, taking the arm with it and leaving not a trace of it left. That was the beauty of such a destructive spell. It could completely destroy a target, especially smaller ones, and that meant there was nothing left for Baragan to use to reattach to himself. With that, he had limited Baragan's control by around half he liked to think. But that wasn't enough to win this fight for him. And he was sure Baragan would be more dangerous than ever now that he knew what he was capable of. He knew he wouldn't have the chance to use Sema again, nor could he gain time to make it as strong as before even if he could. He was too stationary at such moments, and a zero like the one before would destroy him if it hit. Should he try for a different magic here? He still had tricks to play. And if he truly needed it, he could still use Abyss Break. If it was that spell he was certain it would still do a lot of damage to Baragan. In the end however, he didn't need to. Appearing by his side, the man he had been delaying Baragan for arrived. You took your time. I'm sorry. Thanks for doing this, Miss Doggan. I appreciate it. I'll be expecting to be repaid for this, he shot back, noticing the odd look he got in return. Ah, so Nozomi hadn't mentioned anything yet. No wonder he was being looked at like this. Just go ahead and finish him off. I took off an arm for you. So he did go ahead and reattach them, Ichigo muttered, gesturing for Jelal to retreat back a bit as he raised his sword. You might want to get away from here. Far away in fact. I'm not going to hold back. Protector of the Fairies. As Miss Doggan rushed away, Ichigo pushed the odd response he had got from the man out of his mind and focused on the target below. Baragan was looking up at him, and he could tell from the way he was being stared at that Baragan seemed confused. Why was he up here? He reckoned that was what the Hollow was probably thinking. This was different from before, and the Hollow was probably unsure of what had changed. Hopefully the answer would become obvious. Raising his sword up, he was about to reach for the energy he needed when he paused. Mavis. So you can finally hear my voice again, he heard her speak to him. I was wondering when I'd finally get through to you. Had he been hearing her all this time? He didn't remember ever hearing her. Hey, that's rude. I'm sorry, Mavis. I wasn't quite myself. You still aren't, he heard her mutter snidely in his mind. Not that it matters. I was worried for a while when I realized you weren't listening. Guess you just didn't want to back then because you knew I'd stop you, so you blocked me out. I'm just glad someone made you see reason again. So I am, Ichigo replied honestly. Which is why I'm going to do what I should have done a long time ago now. And you want to borrow some magic, am I right? You were just taking it before, without asking, so why ask now? Did you mind? He heard her scoff from her end. You think the amount you took was enough to even cause a problem for me? It's like you filled up a bucket each time you went to use my magic as you did, but you're filling the bucket from an ocean. No, I didn't mind. I was just annoyed you weren't speaking to me. I figured that was the case, Ichigo stated. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have ignored you like that, especially when this chance to win is only thanks to you. You bet it is. With your power and my magic, we're unstoppable. Which is why I want to ask you for the right to use it this time, Ichigo said to her. Rather than taking it myself, will you give it to me instead? Of course, came her immediately response. It'll always be there for you to use. And I'll always be there to help you. Just. Her voice dropped quiet for a moment before she finally said, just please promise me you won't ignore me like that again. It's lonely, trying to reach out for someone and having them not even realize you're there. I think I felt a fragment of what Zera must have felt during all those years of solitude, unable to speak to the Celestial Spirit King. So please don't do that again. Please don't leave me in silence. I won't. I promise. Good, she said as her voice came back, cheerful once again. Like I said back on Tenro, our magic will forever be as one. So long as you never leave me, I will never abandon you no matter what you do. Take as much magic as you want. Or rather, I'll give you all of it if you need it. We're partners, from the beginning of time all the way to the end. So go. End this with one swing. Right. Energy flooded his body, more than he actually needed. He couldn't blame Mavis for being overly excited in her attempts to help here, not when he had been ignoring her for the rest of the fight. So he directed all he could up to the blade, pouring every last drop of the newly gained energy into the blade, letting the energy spiral out around the blade, the aura around the blade increasing in size immensely until it even gained the appearance of wings forming near the hilt. Was this her doing? He did know how much she loved her fairies. He felt his arm begin to buckle suddenly as the energy increased further. He wanted to tell Mavis that this was enough, but she seemed so happy right now. So instead he took the extra energy and forced it onto his right arm, strengthening the limb further and further beyond his existing limits. "Mavis, let's go. Go on. Finish it." He nodded, tightening his grip as much as he could on his sword. "Get Juga." Baragan was starting to move, a black zero forming before him, but it was too late to stop his swing. Tenshao. And with one swing, the entire world around them was filled with light. All except in one place, with a single speck of darkness remained as a man dressed like a priest with a metal mask watched from afar. Protector of the Fairies. The Fairy and the Viper. As the light surrounding everything began to fade, a blade fell from the sky, slamming into the ground. Its wielder quickly followed afterwards, landing beside the blade and lifting it up with his left hand. Then he returned his attention back to the enemy present, beginning to walk over towards where Baragan should still be. "Mavis, you still hearing me?" Loud and clear, came the familiar voice, slightly shakier than usual. "That was stronger than you thought, right?" "Yeah. I think I gave you a bit too much power." "That's fine," Ichigo muttered, glancing briefly at his right side before letting out a sigh. "Though I'd appreciate it if you give me a bit of a warning next time before letting me use so much. This really hurts right now." "Hurts? What are you?" "I'm on my way." "Mavis. Don't you Mavis me, I'm in your mind right now. I know what just happened. I'll be there as quickly as I can." He let out a sigh at the sound of determination in her voice, knowing she was unlikely to listen to him no matter what he said. "Very well. But at least teleport over here with Fairy's sphere. It'll be quicker overall, and far less dangerous to cross this distance alone. I'll be there shortly. Don't worry, I'll be safe." Well, hopefully she had listened to him, he thought as she went quiet. Even if Baragan wasn't much of a threat at this stage, it was still risky. If Wywak or Zeref were around for any reason, looking for an opportunity to strike, it would be dangerous for her to travel too far alone. Until she arrived though, it was important to focus on finishing off the enemy before him, if the enemy wasn't dead already. "Ichigo." He glanced up at Mistogen's voice, the man landing beside him with his meteor spell fading away. "That was some light show." "I thought that was you," came Nozomi's voice as she stepped out of her portal nearby, reaching his side quickly before her eyes latched onto where his right arm had been. "What happened to your arm?" she muttered in shock, tearing her eyes away from the sight to glare at him for an answer. "What did you do? Would you believe me if I said it wasn't my fault?" he asked as he chuckled, noticing how her glare didn't seem to let up. "Figures. All right, it might have been partly my fault. I might have allowed Mavis to be a bit too enthusiastic. This, as you can see, is the result." "Fascinating," muttered Mistogen as he stepped in closer, peering at the area where the limb had been and where it had been burnt shut at the shoulder. He couldn't resist poking it, much to Ichigo's annoyance, before a smile broke out across his face. "Truly fascinating. Do you mind?" "1 minute please," Mistogen stated, ignoring Ichigo's request as he continued to watch the wound with interest. He only had to be a bit patient to see the flesh move slightly and for a small area to repair itself. "Ah, there it is. Your regeneration truly is impressive, but it is rare to see wounds on such a scale like that. A severed arm typically wouldn't take this long for your body to heal, unless of course you did something with your magic that overloaded the area of your body. Until it can repair the areas damaged from your own usage of magic, it won't be able to bring back the full limb. How long do you think that will take anyway? 5 minutes? 10? Longer? I don't know," Ichigo stated, getting more and more uncomfortable with each passing second. "The magic ended up tearing the arm apart since I had to strengthen it beyond its limit in order to use that attack just now. But since I can still absorb magic, there isn't too much that needs to be repaired and wait on. If my body can make use of all the magical power held within it right now, then it'll be instant once it regains the ability to rebuild my arm. But until that happens, I don't know how long it will be or whether the magic in my body can help speed up the process. Shame. I was hoping to be able to observe it in action." Let me know when you have an accurate time frame on this, wouldn't you? There aren't many willing subjects out there for viewing regeneration in action. You're oddly interested in this, Miss Doggan. Oh, I'm not Miss Doggan. Confusion solved. Jalal paused for a moment before finally looking away from the shoulder the arm had been attached to in order to look at the man's face instead. Oh yeah, should have introduced myself sooner. Jalal Fernandez, criminal and destroyer of the previous Magic Council. What? That's not. Jalal tilted his head slightly at Ichigo's confusion. You were aware of this possibility, right? Glancing over at Nozomi, he ignored her furious expression in order to ask her instead. He knew, right? I'm aware you did, but Miss Doggan must have. Ah. How amusing. Even in death he still gives me some laughs. Nozomi? Ichigo asked, looking to her desperately for answers. What's he talking about? Is this a joke Miss Doggan's playing? I'm sorry, she muttered sadly, looking away. I didn't want you to learn this yet. In fact, you weren't meant to, she added, glaring back up at Jalal. He was not meant to tell you yet. I can't help it if I didn't listen to that. I did at least wait until after he started to fight again. I'm sorry about this, Ichigo, Nozomi said as she turned back towards him. I couldn't tell you at the time, but Miss Doggan gave himself up when you were all in Hueco Mundo. Something happened in his fight, we believe, and so Jalal came back. At the time you were still reeling over Shinji's death and weren't. Well, you know what you were like. No one dared try and push you any further. But how is this possible? Ichigo muttered in disbelief. Miss Doggan never said anything like this was happening. He never showed. He sighed sadly as he shook his head. He never told me, did he? That this was happening. I'm afraid not, Nozomi replied softly. I knew because he needed a weapon, and because he knew that I would listen to his selfish request. And that I could be cold enough to kill him if necessary if he ever raised a hand against you. Beyond that, I believe Mest knew. But then Mest knew about a lot of stuff, and it's hard to know if he has really told us everything at times. It could be that he had already seen it happen. If he didn't say anything to you, then perhaps he felt you wouldn't be able to prevent it, or that it couldn't be prevented at all. I simply don't know. So Miss Doggan is gone too, Ichigo muttered, glancing at the man that he knew wasn't his friend but a potential enemy instead. And yet you're still here? I'm surprised, to be honest. Jalal shrugged. Call it lingering sentiment that benefits my own interests. I'll help this war be won, but afterwards I'm free just like Hades is. It's fair terms. I meant specifically here, with me. Lingering sentiment again, Jalal muttered. I personally have no attachment to you. You're as worthless to me as individuals prisoners were at the Tower of Heaven. But Miss Doggan left his mark annoying enough. To me you're nothing, but to him you were everything. So it gives me some mixed feelings on such matters. I won't serve you like he did, I won't submit to anyone ever again, but I will listen to you and offer a hand on occasion when it benefits me. That's all. Is that so? Ichigo asked before glancing at the spear strapped to Jalal's back. Jalal noticed his stare before pointing back at it. This is mine now. I quite like it. That's fine. But if you don't mind, could you tell me how Miss Doggan went out? Was it willing? Or did you rip control from him? I ripped it away from him. Are you lying? Yes. But how do you know I'm not saying that to avoid being cut down by you right now? I don't, Ichigo replied. But I like to think Miss Doggan would have been strong enough to resist you. And if it was to defeat an enemy he couldn't stop himself, who might be a threat to the rest of us, I could see him letting you out to protect us. You could be correct. Congratulations on not breaking down at another death, by the way. Jalal. Nozomi snarled, glaring at the smirking blue-haired mage. It's all right, Nozomi, Ichigo stated as he turned away from Jalal. If I had been told about this before, I might have ended up worse off than I was. I won't pretend that it wouldn't have happened, not when Miss Doggan's death was also in Hueco Mundo like Shinji's. But I can't change that now. And in the end, Miss Doggan did the same thing I would have done. I can't fault him for something I'd do myself. See, Nozomi. You have nothing to worry about now, Jalal stated, aiming his smirk at her as Ichigo turned away from the two of them. Congratulations. Your plan worked just as you wanted. You saved your precious dash. Enough, Jalal. She snarled back. Don't pretend like you weren't aiming to ruin it. I wasn't. But I had to ensure your work succeed. My own life may depend on it in the future. Sickening. Both Jalal and Nozomi's gazes snapped towards the source of the noise, seeing Ichigo heading towards it. Absolutely sickening. I'm not sure whether I should be impressed you survived that or revolted that you're still alive, Ichigo stated, glancing at the form of Baragan as he crawled out of the crater. It wasn't a skeleton that greeted them however but the decrepit form of an old man. One arm was missing from Baragan and his other was withered away, barely able to pull himself forward with equally weakened legs. The usual muscular form he had in this state had degraded to the state before them, and one eye appeared to be missing along with a lot of the flesh on one side of the man's face. Look at you, Ichigo muttered. Pathetic. What did you do? Use the last bit of magic you had and throw it into defense? Even your resurrection is gone now, and I can't sense any magical power left in you. You aren't even drawing any in. I bet you damaged your body too much by trying to pull in more magic than you could handle and now you're paying the price for that, like I've done in the past. Stepping closer towards Baragan, Ichigo watched the man for any signs that the man was faking before finally sighing. No more tricks left, huh? This is really it. I hate you. I know, Ichigo stated. And I hate you. I hate you so much. In the end I guess this is something we both have in common. And I'll make sure it'll be the only thing. You almost did win, said Ichigo as he crouched down beside Baragan, using his sword as support as he stabbed it into the ground. That is what you wanted. I didn't need to die physically. I just had to become like you and you would win, even if you died. You wanted me so filled with hatred that I could see nothing else. Not kindness, not compassion, not love, not anything. Except pain and anger, emotions that would burn inside me forever until the day I die. But I was stopped before that, he continued, glancing backwards at Nozomi with a smile. Before everything died, someone reached out to me and pulled me back. They reminded me of what else I still had. Of what I could still do. And in that one moment, I became different than you again. Glancing back at Baragan, he sighed. But it's through this all that I realized something. You wanted me to be just like you. Which means you felt the same as I did. That rage and anger and pain. How much of it do you blame yourself for? How long has it festered inside you? And could you have been saved if someone had reached out for you in time too? Don't you dash. I pity you, Ichigo stated. Because you are what you wanted me to be. And that's my fault. Your friends and family perished because of me. They were bad people but they still mattered to you. Maybe you had others that mattered outside of the guild, maybe you didn't, but in the end you are a product of my actions. I'm the source of it. The origin. And for that, I'm at least sorry. You dare pity me? But everything after this point is on you, Ichigo said as he ignored Baragan's retort. You turned yourself into a hollow, and when that happened all that was left was that pain. And then you decided to drag others into this. If you went after me alone I could have forgiven you but you went too far. How many thousands have died in this war because of the two of us? Because of this old grudge about an event years and years ago? How many innocents, completely unrelated to either of us, have perished for your selfish goals? Ichigo sighed. In the end, I still want to kill you just as much as you want to kill me. But when I do so, I won't become like you. Because I know what I need to do next. I know what I shouldn't do and what I must do. Goodbye, Baragan Luzenbairn. You plan to kill me like this? Baragan snarled as Ichigo got to his feet. No. I refuse to accept it. It doesn't matter what you wish. Just that this long battle between us ends now. Your time is over. How did you come back? Baragan screamed at him, his one hand trying to reach out and claw at Ichigo's foot. He died. Shinji Hirako died. He is never coming back. Because of you. I know, Ichigo muttered softly. Shinji's gone. And I doubt I'll ever be able to forget that fact. But I won't be you. I won't only cling to the pain that comes with that memory. If I want to even have a hope of saving anyone else, I can't keep looking back at the ones I failed to save and remembering just that. I have to accept that he's gone, and move forward. Something you couldn't do. No. This isn't the end. Baragan screamed, not even noticing as Ichigo's sword was raised upwards. I shall never die. Not until I destroy you first. Everything you love. Everything you cherish. I'll take it all away. Just like you did. Trying to struggle to feet that could barely support his way, Baragan tried one last desperate attempt to reach out towards Ichigo. Not until I've destroyed you. He muttered as his voice grew weaker. Not until this pain ends. I have to. Stop this pain. Goodbye, Baragan. Ichigo's sword came back down and sliced straight across the man, severing him half by his shoulder. You can stop now. Stop. Baragan's voice grew quiet, his form falling to the ground. I can't. This world is cruel. I hate. His final breath left him, leaving a silence in its place as the last bit of life vanished from the hollow. It's over, Ichigo muttered, stepping away from the body by his feet. It's finally over. Not quite, Jalal stated. He's only one of 4 leaders, remember. Alvarez still has its almighty army out there and Ziref could remake his any time he wants. And Wywak? Who knows what he'll do? That can be dealt with later, stated Nozomi, shooting an annoying glare at Jalal before letting it fade after a few moments. Right now this is a victory. The greatest one of the war so far. We should be happy about it. It's certainly one less threat to deal with, Ichigo stated, glancing around a bit on confusion. Huh. That's odd. What's wrong? Asked Nozomi, the faintest flicker of magic already at her fingertips. A brief glance over at Jalal revealed a similar response from him, both of them on edge for whatever was drawing Ichigo's attention. Is it another Ukin? Ichigo shook his head. No, it's not that. I just thought I felt something. Maybe it's my imagination, but... Mavis, what's the status on the barrier? He frowned when he got no response. Mavis, can you hear me? I know I ignored you before, but this really isn't the time for jokes like this. I'm being serious here. There was still silence to his words. What was taking her so long? Mavis? This isn't funny right now. Thinking about it, she should have gotten here much faster by now. Fairy Sphere would have protected her from any threats, and by using it to shift in space she should have had no problems getting back to him safely. Had she not listened and walked instead? If she did that, who knows what threats lying in wait could have struck out at her. At least in the barrier there was only one person who could get to her, and he didn't sense Wywak anywhere nearby. Wait, was that truly right? Wywak was the only one who could break Fairy Sphere with magic, but that didn't mean there wasn't other ways to get to her, even if she was trapped inside it still. Nozomi, can you check the area a bit? I'm going to keep trying to reach her. Jalal. Could you please help? Mavis is the thing this war is fought after, is she not? He nodded at that. Then fine. We cannot risk her failing into the enemy's hands. Thanks. If you look above, perhaps you'll find something dash. There's no need for looking. She's with us. Ichigo froze as the presence of 2 men appeared behind him, immediately leaping away with Jalal and Nozomi. Glancing at the men who had appeared from the shadows behind them, he narrowed his eyes as he noticed the lack of typical magical power and the replacement that was there instead. It was too foul to miss now that he could see the man. Who the hell are you? Me. The first of the men stabbed his staff into the ground, the eye on the top of the staff beginning to glow with dark energy. The name I took up is Arlok. And I am the head priest of the organization known as Avatar. You should have at least heard about us by now. I have, Ichigo snarled, his sword being held up ready for any signs of attack. To his left and right he could feel the buildup of energy from his 2 allies, both ready to act on a moment's notice to the new threat. What the hell have you done with Mavis? If you've harmed even a hair on her head dash. Please relax. She is fine, stated Arlok. Indeed, her barrier is incredibly powerful now that she has regained her full strength. It is truly strong, unlike the barrier around your forces. As it stands, it will take quite some time for us to penetrate it, even with our god's power. But we can do it. Ichigo's grip on his sword tightened at the spoken threat. What do you want? For you to come visit us, Arlok replied simply. Very soon we shall perform an event that shall shake the foundation of this world. But there must be witnesses. There must be those there to struggle and fall in the face of the new world. All I require of you is for you to be there, alongside all those like you. When you say like him, Jalal asked, do you mean those that are Shinigami, those that are hybrids, or something greater? The Ukin. Why, of course there is only one possible option in there, stated Arlok, his voice growing heavy with hatred as he spoke his next few words. The agents of such despicable magic must be there for the end of it. It's done, stated the second man, Ichigo, and the others finding their eyes being drawn to the man who had been hiding in the other's shadow. Standing up from a crouch from beside Baragan's body, he held out a hand with a dark orb held in it, the orb pulsating with dark energy every few moments. The last piece has been acquired. Perfect keys. You have done a great deed today. That orb, muttered Ichigo, glancing briefly at Baragan. What did you do? That would ruin the surprise, wouldn't it? Arlok stated. But you shall see soon. I should thank you though. Thanks to you, Baragan died full of hatred and pain. He died cursing the world, something we have all come to terms with it. We look forward to your arrival. Don't think about trying to stop us here if you're considering about doing so though. We won't harm your pretty little friend, but if we don't return then our associates know to begin elimination of her. And I doubt you could find her in time before that happens. And when the time comes? Ichigo asked in anger. Where will we meet you for this so-called event you have planned? Oh, trust me, you will all know, Arlok replied arrogantly, tapping his staff once again against the ground and causing energy to reach out from the ground around him and keys. You are an agent of magic. So you will know where to go when the call to war sounds. As the energy formed, it generated the large shape of a right hand and grabbed the two within its grasps, pulling them into the ground and leaving no trace that there were they. So they finally made their move, I see, Jalal muttered, glancing over at where Baragan's body still remained. What did they take, do you think? Magic? No, not really their thing. The soul maybe. It doesn't matter right now, Ichigo stated as he turned towards Nozomi. Can you get us back to the barrier? I have a bad feeling, right? He was cut off as a groan left his lips, collapsing to one knee as his sword glowed and separated back into 3 blades. Crap. I felt that. What's happening? Nozomi asked, leaning down by his side as he carefully picked up the golden knife. Are you alright? I've been using my Bankai for quite some time now, Ichigo muttered. But I probably put a lot more strain on my body once I started using Mavis's power on top of that. I've never maintained my Bankai for this long before, nor used it like this at all. I just felt my connection to Mavis dim too, so suddenly a lot of the energy I've been running off fading at once, and now my body feels like crap. Carefully getting back to his feet with Nozomi's help, he sheathed his Zanpakuto before giving a long look at the knife in his hands. Without Mavis here there wasn't any way to seal it away. Not when it required both of them to do so. In the end he settled for holding it, keeping a tight grip on it at all times. Anyway, we need to get back to the barrier. It might be my imagination, but I thought I felt something, and without Mavis to confirm or deny this we can't rule out such a possibility that something happened. Are you sure? If we hurry we might be able to track down Mavis still. Ichigo shook his head. It's too late now. They must have got her before she could reach me. So long as Arlok wants me and the others, she'll be fine. She's insurance after all. For now we need to hurry back. I've got a bad feeling about this. Protector of the Fairies. What the hell's going on? Laxus demanded, storming out of his tent at the chaos he had heard from within. Looking around he could only describe the situation as one of pure chaos. In the distance he could see a large hole in the barrier, as if something had smashed its way right through it, and it appeared like there was black rain falling on their allies further away. Fried? Report. Sorry Laxus, said Fried as he rushed to his side. We're not sure of what's happening right now. Gray said he recognized what was happening and rushed off before we could stop him. Natsu took chase too, but when the rest of us went to help. Well, we can't get past the barrier. The barrier. Frowning, he followed Fried's gaze towards the edge of the camp that signified Fairy Tale's grounds in the army. Near the edge there was a faint glow from dark lines across the ground, lines he was pretty sure might be runes now that he thought about it. But that didn't explain why they were still here. Can't you dismantle it? The shake of Fried's head was a sign of worry. Fried was one of the best rune users out there. So long as he recognized the language it was written in, rewriting it was easily within his level of ability. And in the cases where the language was an unknown one, there were ways to learning it and analyzing how to make a way out. It would merely take time. How long will it take you to try? It's not that, Fried replied quickly. I've already tried. I know the language, but any attempts I make to rework it get rejected. It's like the one you made the barrier knows my magical power. That's odd, Laxus muttered, glancing back at the hole in the barrier. They made a real dent in that thing too. You know many things that can break through this kind of barrier. Unfortunately no. Me neither. Mostly. There was one thing. Magical barrier particles could do it though. They've done it before. Magical barrier particles? What are those? Something quite foul, muttered Laxus in annoyance. If they're here, it's a problem. Assume your magic will be weakened against them. I'd reckon that same enemy in the distance is a user of that power too, and that Gray and Natsu have history with them. In the meantime, Laxus continued as he swept his gaze across the camp, prepare an area for those still wounded. We were trapped in here for a reason. Now that could be to keep us out, but it could also be to keep us in. We used the same tactic ourselves back in the day. So until we know which it is, we need to be prepared for both. Hurry and alert the others. Laxus. Was Fried shaking? He stared directly at his old apprentice, frowning at the fearful look the green-haired mage was making. What's wrong? He demanded. An expression that fearful was not one he could afford to spare kindness on. The runes, stammered out Fried, his gaze locked on the edge of the barrier keeping them in. They looked familiar. I thought they did. But they're too familiar. Like I've seen them before. How familiar are we talking? Familiar enough that they could have been my own work. If they're that familiar, shouldn't it be easier to interwait? Runes were typically written in the style of the one writing them. Each user had their own little quirks and ways to write them. For them to be this familiar, it could mean that the writer was familiar enough with Fried to copy his style or had seen this combination of runes before. And the only time that could have been was once, when they had been deployed around Magnolia. The list of people who could have seen the runes back then wasn't long when he considered the amount of people who might also understand them. And even if they had been seen, it would require someone of immense talent to have also seen the entirety of the runes that day. They would have had to circle the entire city to read them all or have known the structure of them beforehand. He fell into the latter category only because Fried had showed him the runes in a smaller form beforehand, in order to test them correctly, and there had been no one else that day. And he couldn't think why someone would have circled the whole city just to study the barrier, much less remember all the details of it. For now, go and make sure everyone's alright and that those who can fight can. I need to check on something. Fried rushed away at his words, but he was barely noticing that, his feet taking him towards the barrier edge as quickly as possible. The black runes seemed to glow as he approached, like they were warning him to back away, but he got as close as he could so he could eye them carefully. Definitely familiar, he muttered, reaching out with his left hand towards the barrier. Immediately he withdrew it as the foul energy lashed out. But more vicious. And not because of rune usage. Glancing at the runes again, he let out a frown before he reached out with his right arm this time. The energy lashed out once more, but it hardly hurt. The scales that covered it did their job well. His hand managed to reach the barrier edge before it faltered, an invisible pressure holding it back. Just like Fried's, he muttered, withdrawing his hand back and looking back at the runes. He couldn't see any flaws in them, or any differences from Fried's own beyond the energy powering them. They truly were identical in that regard, though whoever set this up was definitely someone with their own style. The language setup was perfect, but the way each letter was written was very different from Fried's own. But it was still familiar too. It was like someone had mixed together Fried's way of structuring runes with Levi's way of writing the runes. The former was something that could be copied. The latter wasn't. And he was sure Fried must have noticed this too. Had he not wanted to say anything? Had he not wanted to accuse a fellow mage of treachery? Well, considering Levi was the one accused, it was fair enough. She had been in a coma for so long, though to the knowledge of most she had merely been away for a long time. If he wasn't aware of her circumstances, he would have thought she was being controlled. But even if she was, this energy wasn't hers. It was a conundrum. 3 separate factors, all together in one place. What did it mean? Who could have done this? Was it a combined job? And how did no one notice someone setting this up? They would have had to act extremely fast to write all of this in time. It took Fried a while to write the runes around Magnolia, but he could work peacefully because not many would encounter him as he worked. Here, the area was smaller, but there were more eyes watching. It must have been written rapidly, Laxus muttered out loud, glancing at each rune in turn. By someone fast enough to do this without our notice. So they either had speed on their side or could deploy it from a distance, but that would still need them to write it quickly. Whatever the case, he still needed to work out whether or not this was meant to trap them or keep them from interfering. If it was to separate them from the battle going on, why choose a barrier like this? There were potentially stronger options, as this barrier had its flaws. Fried could make a much better one nowadays, so the user must have considered the possibility of it falling. If he considered that to be the case, then it was far more likely that the barrier was to keep them in for some reason. But why this barrier? That was what he didn't get. It was more like it was sending a message of some kind. A message only they should understand. But what was it? An explosion rocked the area around him just as he was about to come to an answer, turning towards the center of the camp. A flash of light caught his eye as he turned, what looked like black lighting flashing downwards at the source of the explosion. He didn't bother taking the slow route this time to collect his thoughts. This time he was moving as fast as he could. His body turned to lightning and he was darting straight towards the source of the noise, darting past any barriers in his way as quickly as possible. He could see some of the tents had been blasted away as he got nearer, with one of the larger still standing, having a new giant hole in its ceiling. Hadn't that been where he had directed Fried to tell everyone to take those who couldn't fight? His anger flared up at the thought of those in there. Those were his guildmates. His family. If even a single hair on their head had been harmed, he wouldn't forgive the person responsible. Turning to normal just outside the tent, the others surrounding it turned to look at him. He was glad to see they had reacted so quickly, but what he hadn't expected to see on them was confusion. They should be as furious as he was right now, and yet none of that seemed to register on their faces. They just looked lost, like they were unsure on what was going on. "Out of my way," he ordered, the few in front of him quickly pushing back out of his path as he stormed forward. If they wanted to act like gaping fish, then go ahead. Meanwhile he'd crush this enemy here and now. "You got here fast," came his voice as he entered the tent. That was odd. Did he say that? He didn't think he did. He frowned as he stared at the black-cloaked enemy in the tent, the man's back to him. Quickly glancing at everyone in the tent, he had held out hopes that they would still be fine. But not all of them were. Some were groaning on the floor, their beds overturned and with burns across different parts of their body. The source of that pain was obviously the man with black lightning dancing across his body, though that very action looked familiar to him. His did that too. Was this another lightning slayer of some kind? His eyes inevitably moved to Levi, however. She had been moved here too, and she was still only recently out of her coma. He found her quickly though, pinned to the ground by another assailant. Like the first, this one was also cloaked, though he could see their arms sticking out, pinning Levi to the ground by her throat with one hand and using her other hand to pin both of Levi's hands above her head and against the ground. In a normal situation he might not have been so worried for Levi. Her skill with her magic let her write words with the smallest of movements, a skill she polished over years. But with her weakened state and her current position, it would be incredibly difficult. But most enemies wouldn't know how well Levi could write and know to try and pin her like this. It was inconceivable for an ordinary opponent to know the precautions to take against her so quickly. Turn around slowly. Too many odd events were happening here. The runes, the similarity to the Battle of Fairy Tale, the familiar feeling he got from the lightning, the way the enemy knew how to deal with Levi, all of it was setting off alarm bells in his head. But he could get his answers later once they were beaten into the ground. Anyone who harmed a member of Fairy Tale was an enemy. You really have done well for yourself, the man stated. That voice. No, he was imagining things. He had to be Guild Master of Fairy Tale. That truly is a wonderful thing. I'm happy for you, Laxus. When I took the role, it was of a ragtag group of mages with barely 8 of us left. Envious. He thought Levi spoke for a minute, but when he glanced over there he saw her still pinned. Her eyes were wide with fear though, but that fear was directed at the one on top of her and didn't seem to even focus on anyone else. The voice must have been the man's companion then, definitely female going by the voice. By the similarity to Levi's own. Hardly. You take what you get. Doesn't stop me being happy for him. Even if that happiness ends today. Turn around slowly, Laxus repeated, getting impatient and causing lightning to flicker across his body. Show me your face. You're smart, Laxus, the man stated, beginning to turn. I'm sure you have already realized it yourself. Levi already has, but then she was always so smart. I said show me your face. Laxus roared, closing the distance between the two and reaching out with his left hand. His own hand was swatted away as the man spun to face him, but the action alone ripped the hood down, revealing a full head of blonde hair, a fake left eye in the form of an orb, and a familiar lightning bolt scar across the right. His eyes widened in disbelief before they quickly glanced to the other assailant, whose face had been exposed beneath their hood as they turned to face him in the commotion. In that brief moment he could see blue hair, looking like it had been pulled back, and scars across her forehead and cheek. He knew these faces. No wonder everyone else had been shocked to move in. He was feeling the same feeling right now, but at the same time he could feel everything clicking into place. Runes with Levi's style, but in a formation he would know. Voices and appearances that greatly resembled their own. Lightning that acted in a familiar way, and knowledge on how to limit Levi's available options. It all suddenly became clear at the sight before him. Hello, Laxus, said the image of himself, looking older certainly but still very much like himself. We've been looking forward to meeting the people we used to be. Protector of the fairies. A twisted mirror of the future. How, muttered Laxus, taking a step back in disbelief as his doppelganger turned to completely face him. His eyes quickly narrowed as he regained his ground, lightning flickering around his body in anger. What kind of magic is this? If this is meant to be me, then you've messed up a lot of details. Well, I suppose you could call it a kind of magic, his doppelganger replied, an arrogant smirk so similar to his old ones appearing before his eyes. The Eclipse Gate is so useful, isn't it? He wanted to deny the possibility, but he already knew it was possible. Mest was proof of that. And looking closely at his doppelganger, there were differences. Most could easily be a result of age, but not all of them. Did no one tell you? His doppelganger asked mockingly, the smirk he saw implying far more than his words did. Had this version of him encountered others? When could this have been? The games, he heard spoken from Levi weakly, struggling to get her words out before her own doppelganger tightened her grip on her throat. Now, no talking me, the other version of Levi stated. We can't have you casting any annoying spells here. So why don't you be silent? Levi's struggles fell deaf to his ears suddenly. He could see her trying to break free still, her mouth occasionally opening as she struggled to breathe, but not a sound came from her. But he hadn't sensed any magic get used. All he had felt was disgust. That couldn't be right, could it? She's as perceptive as always, he heard his doppelganger say, drawing his attention back. It took quite a few times to get it all right, mind you. Countless repeats, trying to make sure the loops the others made continued. Rogue and Lucy proved so helpful to play with. Such a shame that Lucy's future self was so persistent in her actions. We'd hoped she would have died faster when we dealt the fatal blow. He had to visibly stop himself from rushing forward at those words, and he could tell he wasn't the only one. No one else had made a move yet, but he could feel the telltale signs of magic being gathered and prepared, like electricity running across his skin. If it wasn't for the fact that the ones saying this were versions of him and Levi, he was sure they would have already been bombarded by every type of magic that the guild could throw at them. Ichigo knew, didn't he? He asked, trying to calm his anger at the man in front of him and instead focus on the questions he wanted answered. A quick glance at Levi again showed that her doppelganger was only restraining her currently, admittedly with severe means, but that also meant she was a hostage at worst and wasn't yet in true danger. Natsu too, I reckon. Oh? So you were aware of something? I couldn't help but be suspicious, he stated as he pointed to the eye patch he had taken to wearing, covering his missing eye. With a quick flick he exposed the missing piece of him to his doppelganger, noticing how he didn't even flinch from the sight. Another point of evidence towards his words being true, he supposed. The doppelganger would have been aware of this if he was his future self. When Ichigo saw this, he looked shocked. Far more shocked than I had been prepared for, and I thought I had seen horror even for a brief moment. From Natsu though, he was there when it happened. He didn't truly act strange until part way through, but thinking about it there's the possibility that it simply didn't connect immediately in his mind. But when he did he was furious. I suppose it was acknowledge for you too. He frowned. You don't know. Of course I don't, his doppelganger shot back. This isn't my timeline. Half of you are ghosts in my mind. I saw most of you die, and the rest might as well have been dead with what little life that was left in the lot of us. But I do know that time has a way of trying to fix itself. It doesn't like to change. It detests it even. Even if you change something major, sometimes the small details like to correct themselves or will simply continue to occur. Case in point, are similar injuries. Though Levi over there is a far greater case of that. Mind showing him Levi? Bit hard over here, Levi's doppelganger called back, smirking a bit as she released her grip on Levi's neck and immediately used her hand to grab the girl by her hair and pull her up from the ground. Immediately Levi was trying to act, words beginning to form as fast as she could make them, but before she could complete it he saw her other self slam a knee into the back of Levi's leg. Her weak leg. Any attempts Levi had to fight back failed at that same moment, a silent scream leaving her lips as she lurched forward only to be held up from the ground by her own hair. Oh, did that hurt? Her doppelganger asked mockingly. Considering where I found you, I reckon this happened recently, right? So it must still be sore. Sore enough that not even you can ignore such pain. I should know, I felt the same pain a long time ago. It's like your own nerves are screaming at you at first. He heard his own doppelganger laugh, likely at his attempts to hide his anger, only to notice the look Levi shot him briefly before she was roughly pulled back and had his arm tighten around her neck. He knew that look. It was one she showed when she had a plan. Did she have a way to get her out of her other self's grip? She would know herself best, but the same could be said of the one holding her. Better in fact. Unless there was something he was missing. He couldn't dwell on it any longer, however, not when his focus was drawn by the future version of his friend placing her head side by side with her present self. Almost spitting image, right? The doppelganger stated, and for the most part it was true. Her doppelganger had her hair longer, not kept short but instead tied back in a long braid that fell down her back, but the scars present were pretty much identical. Except... Where did you get that one? He asked, tracing the same scar he saw over his own face. It certainly looked the worst by far. The others were a result of being caught on the edge of an attack or from being harmed by a blow. But that one looked like she had been stabbed. That hardly looks health to have. Fury. That was what filled the face of Levi's future self. Pure and unrestrained fury, and that emotion tainted every word that she snarled out of her mouth. Funny you should mention that one. That's a result of an abomination stabbing a sword through my head. An abomination? He had heard the last used to describe Ichigo quite a few times in the past, all by people that hated him. And there could be no other emotion but hate in how she felt about the one who had stabbed her. Even the memory of it seemed to fill her with rage. But at Ichigo? Wait, She hadn't said him by name. Perhaps he was overthinking things. But if he wasn't crying, he muttered, remembering what had happened after the battle had ended on that day. He was crying. I'm sorry. What was that? He ignored her for the moment, turning towards his own doppelganger. You died too, didn't you? He could tell those words unsettled those behind him, but he didn't care about their reactions right now. He was too busy watching his own. Both of you were killed. Oh? So maybe you're not as stupid as I feared. I was worried this timeline might have changed you too much, but apparently we still have many more similarities in place. The smirk was still present on his doppelganger's face, but it was barely there, too much rage dulling everything else. Yes, I died that night. As did Levy. I was severed in half, so I got off lucky really. But poor Levy here, well, she had a pretty rough treatment. Needed new arms and even a new leg before she was finally killed. New arms and limbs? It sounded like she had been dismembered before being killed. But then what were those odd limbs she had right now? They certainly didn't feel normal, but maybe they weren't meant to. Maybe they were meant to be like this, replacing her old limbs and making the replacements into weapons of some kind. The question was why she had been dismembered. If the one fighting these future versions of them had been Ichigo, why had he gone to such extremes? Glancing at Levy herself, seeing how tightly she was held by her doppelganger, helped give him his answer. His way of fighting was straightforward and would have been easier to disable or eliminate. But Levy? If she could bear the pain, then it was possible for her to continue fighting even if she lost her arms. If she could make words somehow, even if she wrote them from her blood, she could fight. From the point of view of one trying to stop her, he would go for the limbs. But only if he didn't want to kill her. For them to be killed meant they had shown themselves to someone and died. As enemies, there were honestly few people he could think of that would want to not eliminate them. One of which was the same person who had clung to him and Levy when he had found them. Hadn't he found it odd back then? How desperate Ichigo had been to see them. How desperately he had clung to them, as if he had been afraid they would vanish if he let go. How terrified he had been when he saw his eye, and how relieved he had been when he had heard he planned to keep his arm, which he had yet to fully understand considering his doppelganger had his own hidden. Looking at what he knew, it all made sense. Why Ichigo knew them and why he had acted so oddly that day. It was Ichigo. He killed you both. Their anger only seemed to grow at the mere mention of his friend's name, and he was glad it wasn't directed at him with its intensity. He almost wanted to doubt that they were future versions of himself and Levy if not for the other similarities they had already shown. After what was a tense minute, his doppelganger finally seemed to compose himself enough to respond. Yes. Yes, it was. How horrible it must be to learn this from us, that the man you have called friend for so long is the one that dash. Yeah, I don't care, Laxus said, cutting the doppelganger off before he could get any further, much to his doppelganger's confusion. You died after all the dragons were defeated, unless you didn't encounter Ichigo when I thought you did. But considering I was right about him, I'll trust in the evidence that lead me to that answer. And I know that he was crying that day. Crying because he killed the two of you. Crying. He nodded. Yeah. We didn't understand why back then, and if he wanted us to never know, he could have tried to not even show that. He would have easily been able to do so if he had killed you both out of malicious intent. But he was crying when he came to us. Crying because killing you both must have been the hardest thing he ever did. And if it was that hard, I don't believe he did it as a first choice. Rather, it was the only choice he had left. And if that was the only choice he could take, it means you certainly didn't give him any other options. So why don't you tell me what happened to make him kill you, and we'll see if I really believe you. He was crying. He frowned, glancing at the confusion on his doppelganger's face. It was true that they wouldn't have known about that event after they had died, but why did his doppelganger sound so shocked by that knowledge? Unless the future they came from was so different that even Ichigo had changed so much that he wasn't even similar to the man he knew right now. The war must have dragged on for so long, he said apologetically. Many people must have changed. But if Ichigo did change so much, then he hasn't yet. He's still dash. He was crying. There was no more confusion in his doppelganger's voice as he interrupted him. Even the rage was gone, but what replaced it didn't make him happy in the slightest. Right before his eyes he could see his doppelganger struggling, and failing, to stop laughing, as if the image of Ichigo crying was so hilarious to him that he couldn't contain it. Glancing over at Levi's future self he could see she was in a similar state, laughing her head off and inevitably loosening her grip on her present self. Had Levi noticed? The look she shot him said she had, but why was she not acting yet? Was her plan not ready? Or was she waiting to hear more like he was? Finally the laughter began to die down, their future selves getting a grip on their voices again. I needed that, he heard Levi's doppelganger state with a wide smile. I fucking needing that. That image. A smaller set of giggles escaped her throat as she tried to keep them restrained again. It's just so fucking hilarious. He really wished he wasn't hearing this from Levi's voice. He knew it wasn't her saying these words but it still sounded like her. I wish I'd been there, his own doppelganger muttered wishfully. To see his face break down in despair, to crumble under such pain. It was worth dying and being brought back just to hear that. And how did you get brought back anyway? He asked in annoyance. Typically people stay dead when they are killed but some people do tend to make that harder than it needs to be. As useful as Hades has been, I'd rather he had stayed dead. Gray, well I don't mind him but in both cases they exploited demons. Did you do the same? Demons? You mean counting on Zeref's help? His doppelganger scoffed. I'm sure he planned to do something to our bodies but a medcult stole us first. Brought us back with some kind of crazy resurrection method and then even helped us master our abilities, in exchange for a few favors over the month. The last was opening the way for Baragan's forces, and I do say it was fun to give your Yuaki a run for her money. Jura too, right Levi? He wasn't quite as strong as I remembered, Levi's future self muttered in amusement. It's really impressive how much a month of training with them did for us. Wizard saints became nothing but a minor nuisances. You. He noticed them looking back at him in confusion but he couldn't find the words to open his mouth. Luckily those behind him could. You monsters. Demons. How many did you kill? They're all dead. How could you do it? He could tell that the doppelgangers were slightly confused. Was it at the questions or at the response they were getting? Really, it didn't matter in the end. Just looking at them right now made it hard to focus on anything else but the anger he could feel burning inside him. Everyone seemed to quiet down when he spoke, but maybe it was because of how he sounded. Why did you do it? He didn't raise his voice, nor did he show his anger. Instead, he was just cold. He even recognized the voice from his memories. Gramps had used it in the past. Those in the guild might have only heard it on a very rare occasion, as it took a lot to make Gramps that anger, but he remembered hearing it a bit more when he was younger. His father had been the focus and he had never thought he would be spoken to in that same way, even if the version of him was a future version. The one thing he knew though was that this was effective. It unsettled people not because of the absence of rage but because it was there, controlled and waiting. A wrong answer could set it off. Right now he was effectively a time bomb, and he knew his doppelganger had to know that too. Even if certain memories dulled over the years, this one was he doubted had ever been forgotten. It hadn't been for him. That was probably the only reason his doppelganger hadn't replied yet. He was likely trying to put together an answer that wouldn't make him immediately lash out like Gramps might have done. But the amount of time it was taking was not doing his doppelganger any favors. The longer he waited, the more he learned because it meant the truth had to be twisted so much just to make him keep listening. And that was the odd part of all of this he realized. For whatever reason, their doppelgangers hadn't truly tried to attack them yet. He was sure they would if provoked but they seemed happy to just talk at the moment. Like they were aiming for something and were willing to reveal a lot to obtain that. After what must have felt like ages to everyone watching, and had felt that way for him, his doppelganger finally spoke. Because of Ichigo. Because of Ichigo? That's the answer you're going with. Of course, his doppelganger replied, more confidently once again. I despite him. We both do. And the idea that he lives and breathes fills us with disgust. A world that has him in it is like hell, and so we'll do whatever we can to make it a bit more bearable. And so we opened up the barrier, his doppelganger added, his smirk returning. We don't know what Baragan had planned, but there was no doubt in our minds that the death of tens of thousands of people would weigh heavily on his conscience. The priest seemed to imply there were other events in motion that we were helping push along, but I never really listened to half the stuff he said. All I know is that it was a massacre. So that's the answer you're going to go with, muttered Laxus. Last warning. If you try and say anything else after this, I won't believe you. Ah, but you see, that is why we are here, his doppelganger stated. To ask you to join us. You see, our only goal is to kill him. If some people have to die on the way to that, so be it, but once Ichigo is dead we are more than willing to assist you all in whatever you need done. If we can kill Ichigo, I assure you that we will be very valuable assets to you. Very valuable indeed. Join you? To kill one of our own. Laxus let out a laugh of his own before shooting a look back at his fellow guild members. Would anyone here agree to this if asked? To willingly go after a fellow member of Fairy Tail who hasn't shown hostile intentions towards us? As he expected, not a single person raised a hand or voice in agreement. With a smirk of his own, he turned back to look at his doppelganger. The man's own smirk dropped. Well, it seems no one here quite agrees with you. And in the first place you came here, locked us in a barrier and have harmed some of us. And if I'm not wrong, that's an ally of yours over there attacking the army, right? So that's a no to joining us. Levy's doppelganger muttered in disappointment. Shame, but then we did think we'd be stubborn about this. We were like that too once. But don't worry. You'll still help us. We never needed you alive for that. Laxus's eyes widened as the woman slowly drew out a word in the air, the letters being curved around until she was holding a thin blade made out of the word for steel. Then, as if making a show about it, she began to bring it to Levy's neck. No one around him made a move, not when he threw a hand out to the side telling them to halt. No one could make any sudden movements right now, not when Levy was at such a great risk. However, they all knew this stalemate could not last. If Levy didn't act soon, she'd end up dead herself. It was only as the makeshift weapon was about to be pressed up against Levy's neck did she act, slamming her head back into her doppelganger and causing her other self to let out a swear as her grip broke. Levy immediately tried to get forward, words forming, and he was preparing to move himself, when her doppelganger lashed out with her own good leg and slamming it against Levy's weak one. Levy crumbled slightly under the blow, but this time her words didn't vanish, a smirk appearing on her face before she twisted her body as she fell, directly the smirk straight up at her doppelganger. The doppelganger, realizing too late what that smirk meant as she tried to lunge at her, was immediately blasted by a barrage of rocks from Levy's side, knocking her back before she could summon up a defense of her own. In comparison to the many words Levy had quickly summoned, all her doppelganger brought up was a single large word for shield, all the projectiles slamming into the barrier and leaving not even a single dent in it. But it was enough. Levy was outside of her grip, the two doppelgangers weren't holding onto any other hostages, and that was enough reason for him to finally act. The energy he had been building burst to life and the ground beneath his feet shattered as he pushed off from it, his body turning to lightning in an instant. His doppelganger was just as quick to act, but surprise was in his side, and with his left hand he reached out and grabbed his counterpart in his lightning form. He should have realized something was wrong about it the moment he had realized it was black instead of yellow, rather than just attributing it to some kind of new magic he had learned in the future. This wasn't magic but magical barrier particles. There was no question now when he could feel the energy beneath his fingers. He'd never forget the energy he had devoured and had tearing him up from the inside. Even though he could feel the pain coursing through his body from the contact with the form, he kept up his grip and shot upwards, pulling his doppelganger up with him as high as he could before the future version of himself could break free. This barrier was meant to be like the battle of Fairy Tail that he had once caused, which meant there was no real roof to this barrier. It just stretched upwards, which meant it was incredibly important to get his doppelganger up high if he couldn't take him away from here. At least up in the sky there was less risk to his family. He didn't know what was happening below, however. He had to pray and hope the others could handle Levy's counterpart together. Levy could not handle her by herself, not when she had barely recovered from her injuries, and even against himself he could tell this was not going to be an easy task. Not when his doppelganger used this foul energy. Speaking of the doppelganger, It appeared he was tired of being dragged about. Black lightning shot upwards and he hastily released his grip and backed away. They were high enough now. He could afford to let go, and he was glad he did. His hand hurt like hell from touching his doppelganger in that form. "So the guild master plans to fight me alone, does he?" His doppelganger called over mockingly, stretching out his arms as if to say to take his best shot. "Well, don't let me stop you. Give me your best dash." His doppelganger never got to finish those words. Not when a concentrated blast of magic slammed into him mid-sentence. He didn't even need to look to find the source, recognizing that magic anywhere as three individuals joined him in the skies. Well, it looked like he wouldn't be fighting alone either. And that thought alone brought a smile to his face, even in the face of who he was about to fight. Protector of the Fairies. Reinforce whatever barriers other mages are putting in place. Those that can reach the enemy with magic, open fire. Try and give him less places to run. You know I could be using that whole sky to my advantage if you weren't filling it with spells, Yoryuki stated in annoyance. You know I could do it. And I know just as well that these spells you are getting annoyed at would only be a passing nuisance to dodge. Am I wrong? Yoryuki shook her head with a sigh. Fair enough, Jura. Still, why not let me have a shot at him? If I can close in, I can deal some heavy damage. That's the problem, Jura muttered. If you can close in. The enemy's rate of fire is unlike any other. Don't pretend like I haven't seen you attempting to reach him a few times now. The enemy senses you before you're halfway there and then turns their attention to you. It has helped take pressure off the barriers we've made when they are about to break, your intention I reckon, but the fact you keep returning speaks of the fact that you can't reach him, or at least not without taking serious injury. All right, you got me, Yoryuki said, rubbing her shoulder where a dark scorch mark could be occasionally seen when her hand moved away from it slightly. Didn't expect a single arrow to have so much punch to it, and if you get hit by one it really throws off your approach. There's simply too many for me to dodge easily. That's why we need a coordinated approach if we are to take this enemy down. Your speed will be an important asset provided we can create you an opening to approach in. I'm hoping the other generals present are preparing to strike as we speak and Hibiki will coordinate everyone when ready, but until that happens we need to prioritize our defenses. Unless of course you know someone with enough firepower to break through this barrage with raw power. Not personally, Yoryuki muttered. But if we're talking about firepower, why not that dragon slayer from Fairy Tale? Please be more specific. The fire one. Dragneel or something. Jura scratched his chin for a moment, leaving Yoryuki waiting longer than she expected for an answer as his focus briefly shifted towards the large earth barrier of his own that protected a good chunk of the nearby area. He could see similar barriers in other places, some his, some made by others, and one particularly large ice barrier similar in scale to his main barrier. If he remembered correctly, the only ice mage capable of construction of such a scale would be either Leon or Grey, and the former would have to exhaust all his magic to create it. Going by the flames he could occasionally see over in the area, however, he hedged his bets on the latter. What do you think? He asked, directing Yoryuki's gaze over towards who he assumed was Natsu in the distance. They could both see a large burst of flames appear above the barrier as another wave of black arrows shot towards it, but only a few made it through. He's doing all right at dealing with the focus placed on him currently. Do you think he can draw the enemy's focus entirely? He can, at least for me to approach, stated Yoryuki confidently. At the very least his flame capacity is high enough that he may very well be able to overpower most of the enemy's projectiles. He's strong enough too to act as a distraction since the enemy won't be able to not focus on him. Jura nodded. Very well. I leave this in your capable. Is that one of ours? Yoryuki frowned, glancing at what had Jura so confused. That was until she saw the cloaked figure in the sky, dressed entirely in white in a very familiar style. No. Of all the rotten timings. Indeed, muttered Jura gravely. I'm sorry to have to reduce you to the role of messenger, but dash. No, I get it, Yoryuki stated, glaring at the figure in the sky in annoyance. If a Quincy is here, there's a possibility that their leader might not be that far behind. I'll swallow my pride if it means not fighting him alone. Can you hold out here with your barriers? I will do what I must, Jura replied honestly. Hurry. Hibiki should be at the command tent, so have him inform every strong mage in the area. And while you're at it, could you find out what is taking most of Fairy Tail? I have yet to see Laxus make a move, nor any of the other noticeable mages from Fairy Tail beyond Grey and Natsu. It's odd for them to be inactive at a time like this. I'll do what I can. Stay safe. Jura nodded, glancing back at the figure dressed in Quincy clothes. What were they doing? They looked like they were heading towards the enemy in the sky. Surely they had already seen the risk to doing that? They weren't moving nearly as fast as they should be if they planned to attack. The enemy would be on them in seconds. Unless they weren't going to attack. Perhaps they were allies. Perhaps this new arrival was going to reinforce his friend. Nope. He wasn't. The sight of the enemy bombarding them, turning his focus on this new arrival and firing a barrage of black arrows down at them, destroyed any notion of that. He would have felt sorry for the poor Quincy, stuck directly in the line of fire, if not for the fact they were his enemy. That pity quickly vanished when the Quincy raised his left hand towards the arrows. An aura of light, the purely white he had ever seen, appeared around the Quincy and slowly spread forward, its shape changing until it resembled a left hand being held open at the arrows. Shock quickly took the place of the absent pity when he realized those arrows were slamming into the left-hand construct and doing barely anything. It seemed he wasn't the only one who had noticed this. Other mages across the ground had begun firing attacks in greater force, the enemy responding by pulling the barrier of his gun down at them all and launching another massive barrage. But it couldn't be maintained, not when the Quincy continued to approach and drew the enemy's focus once more. The pattern repeated, and with each step the Quincy took in the sky they were all forgotten about a tiny bit more by the other enemy. The Quincy was obviously the greater threat, and it was taking everything the enemy had to hold him in place. Until the Quincy appeared to have another, it seemed. The moment the gun was turned away from him for even a second, the Quincy finally struck out. His hand appeared to swipe through the air and the construct of light did the same, rushing forward and slamming straight against the enemy above. The moment contact was made, the hand closed around its target, tightening and binding the enemy within before dark energy began to burst forth from all angles from the enemy above them. Preparing for the worst, he strengthened all the barriers he had up before the energy could hit. They struggled under the pressure, but the energy hitting them quickly began to disperse just as fast as it appeared. Above he could see the white hand tightening around the enemy until finally there was no energy coming off from the enemy above. Even the foul sensation he had been feeling before had vanished now, being replaced by only warmth. Hello. Can you all hear me? He frowned as a voice reached him. He didn't recognize it, and looking around at all the men and women nearby he knew all of them could hear it too. It wasn't being sent to his mind either. Was this the Quincy? Were they using some kind of magic to amplify their voice? My name is Pernida Parncages, one of the remaining Sternritter of His Majesty's forces. Well, guess that answered the question on who was speaking then. I would like to request a temporary ceasefire. Ceasefire? He sighed, realizing whatever could cause Wywak to want a ceasefire was not going to be good for them. Just what we need, he muttered to himself. I miss the days where demons were our biggest worry. Protector of the Fairies. Check the description for the links to the author.